Colorado Territory, May 1872. The wind swept across the highlands like Judgment Day itself, cold, unforgiving, and merciless. Calder Hayes stood atop the Ridge Winchester rifle, braced against his shoulder. Eyes narrowed against the setting sun. 3 riders approached his land, their intentions as clear as the dust trail they left behind. Through his scope, he could make out their faces now. The same men who'd burned the Miller homestead 2 days prior. The same men who worked for Judge Edward Grant. Calder's finger rested on the trigger steady, despite the 6 years since he'd last fired at a man. The war between the states had taken enough from him: his youth, his faith, the feeling in 2 fingers of his left hand. But it had taught him patience. When to wait. When to fire. A long scar ran down his weathered cheek, a reminder of Antietam. At 38, he looked older lines etched deep around his eyes, salt beginning to pepper his dark beard. Life on the frontier aged a man faster than whiskey. From the valley below, the sound of laughter drifted up: his daughter Annie playing near the barn with her rag doll. 4 years old, blonde hair wild in the wind, oblivious to the danger approaching. She hadn't spoken a word since her mother's death last winter. Not one. Calder inhaled slowly. He had nowhere left to run, and nothing left to lose, except the 2 things that mattered: his child and his land. He fired once. The shot kicked up dirt 3 feet in front of the lead rider's horse. "That's far enough," he called out, voice carrying on the wind. "Next one won't miss." The men halted the lead rider, raising his hands slowly. "Just passing through Hayes." The man called back. "Like you were just passing through the Miller place before you torched it." Calder worked the lever action, chambering another round. "This is Hayes' land. You're trespassing." The 3 men exchanged glances. The leader, a man Calder recognized as Floyd Jenkins, Judge Grant's, hired muscle, spat into the dirt. "Judge Grant sends his regards, says his offer still stands. $500 for the whole spread. Land's not for sale." Calder kept the rifle trained. "Never will be." Jenkins smirked. "Shame about the Millers. 6 generations on that land gone in one night. Terrible accident." "Wasn't no accident." "Course it was. Just like it'd be a terrible accident if something happened to your place." Jenkins let his gaze drift toward the farmhouse where Annie played. "Or God forbid to that little girl of yours. Hard enough raising her alone after what happened to Martha. Be a shame if—" Calder fired again. This time the bullet took Jenkins's hat clean off his head. "You've got 5 seconds to turn around," Calder said, voice deadly quiet. "Or the next one goes between your eyes." The men retreated, Jenkins cursing as he retrieved his hat from the dirt. Before riding off, he called back, "This ain't over, Hayes. Nobody refuses the judge. Nobody." Calder watched until they were specks on the horizon, then exhaled slowly. His hands were steady, but his heart hammered against his ribs. They'd be back, and not with words, next time. He made his way down the ridge toward the farmhouse, a 2-story structure of timber and stone his father had built 20 years ago. The Hayes Ranch wasn't the biggest in Colorado Territory, but its location controlling access to Eagle Creek, the only reliable water source for miles, made it valuable. Too valuable. Annie looked up as he approached, her blue eyes, so like her mother's, lighting up. She didn't run to him or call out, as she once would have. She simply stood, clutching her doll, waiting. Calder knelt before her, setting his rifle aside. "Hey there, little one." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Everything all right?" She nodded, solemn. "That's good." He forced a smile. "You hungry Hanks probably got supper ready." Another nod. He took her small hand in his calloused one, and together they walked toward the house. Behind them, the sun sank below the mountains, blood-red and ominous. Inside, Hank Miller, the 65-year-old ranch foreman who'd served with Calder's father in the Mexican War, was setting the table. His weathered face creased with concern when he saw Calder's expression. "Trouble?" he asked simply. "Grant's men." Calder hung his hat on the peg by the door, careful to keep his voice casual for Annie's sake. "Making threats." Hank cursed under his breath, then caught himself with a glance at Annie. "Sorry, little miss." Annie didn't react, just climbed onto her chair at the table. "We're short-handed as it is." Hank continued ladling stew into bowls. "Peterson and Walsh quit yesterday. Said they don't want trouble with the judge." "Can't blame them." Calder sat heavily, rubbing his face. "Man owns half the county. Controls the bank, the courts." "Not your land, though," Hank said firmly. "Not yet." "Not ever." Calder's jaw set. "My father didn't build this place to have it stolen by some corrupt judge and his railroad friends." They ate in silence, broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls. Annie ate mechanically, her eyes distant. Calder watched her heart aching. She'd been there when Martha died, trapped in their wagon during the blizzard, watching her mother grow colder as the hours passed, no help in sight. The doctor said the trauma might have stolen her voice forever. After supper, he read to her from an old book of fable stories his own father had read to him. Annie curled against his side, eyes heavy. He carried her to her small room and tucked her in, kissing her forehead. "Sleep tight, little one," he whispered. "Pa's here. Nothing bad's gonna happen." A promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Downstairs, Hank waited with a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. "We need to talk about harvest," the old man said, pouring 2 fingers each. "We're 3 weeks out and down to 4 hands. Won't be enough." Calder nodded grimly. "I'll ride into town tomorrow. See if I can hire a few men." "Good luck with that," Hank snorted. "Grant's made sure everyone knows working for Hayes means making an enemy of him." "I'll find someone." Calder tossed back his whiskey. "I have to." Dawn broke pale and cool over the eastern plains. Calder rode out early, leaving Annie in Hank's care. The journey to Eagle's Pass took 3 hours, the small town appearing suddenly between rocky outcroppings like an afterthought of civilization. Eagle's Pass had grown since Colorado became a territory. What had once been a trading post was now a proper town, with a main street, a courthouse, a bank, and a dozen businesses, all under Judge Edward Grant's influence, if not outright ownership. Calder tied his horse outside the general store, nodding to a few familiar faces. People acknowledged him with cautious respect, but he didn't miss the way conversations quieted when he passed. Inside, Mrs. Smith, a widow who'd run the store since her husband died in '65, greeted him warmly. "Calder Hayes, as I live and breathe. How's that little girl of yours?" "Same as always, Mrs. Smith," he replied, removing his hat. Still not speaking, she clicked her tongue sympathetically. "Poor lamb. And you holding up, managing." He leaned on the counter. "Need supplies and looking to hire some hands for harvest. Know anyone looking for work?" Her expression fell. "Oh, Calder, after what happened to the Millers, folks are scared. Judge Grant's been telling anyone who'll listen that you're next if you don't sell." "I figured," he sighed. "Still need the help, though." "I'll ask around," she promised. Discreetly. He was selecting supplies when the commotion started outside, shouts, a woman's cry, the thud of something hitting the ground. Calder moved to the window. 3 men cowboys by their dress had surrounded a woman who'd fallen to the boardwalk, her belongings scattered around her. Even from a distance, Calder could see the fear on her face. "Who is that?" he asked Mrs. Smith. "Don't know. Stranger. Came in on yesterday's stage from the east." One of the men, young, well-dressed, despite the dust of the trail, leaned down toward the woman. His voice carried through the open door. "I asked you a question, ma'am. What brings a lady like you to Eagle's Pass all alone?" "Please." The woman's voice was steady despite her position. "I'm just looking for work." The young man laughed. "Oh, I bet you are." He reached for her arm. "My father owns this town. I know exactly what kind of work women like you are after." Calder had seen enough. He strode outside, hand resting on the revolver at his hip. "That's enough," he said, voice carrying. "Let the lady be." The 3 men turned. The well-dressed one, Willie Grant, the judge's son, smiled unpleasantly. "Hayes, this doesn't concern you." "Does when you're roughing up women in the street." Calder extended a hand to the woman. "You all right, ma'am?" She hesitated, then took his hand. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd thought, perhaps late 20s, with auburn hair escaping a simple bonnet and intelligent green eyes. Her dress was plain, but clean, her hands rough with work. "Thank you," she said, straightening her skirt. "I'm fine." Willie Grant stepped closer, alcohol evident on his breath, despite the early hour. "Since when does Calder Hayes defend strange women? Unless you're looking to replace Martha already. Bit soon, isn't it?" Calder's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "Walk away, Grant. Now." Something in his tone must have registered even through Willie's arrogance. The younger man backed up a step. "Come on, boys," he said, maintaining his smirk. "Let Hayes have his new whore. He'll need the comfort when my father takes his land." They sauntered away, laughing. Calder turned to the woman who was gathering her scattered belongings, a carpet bag, a worn book, a bundle wrapped in cloth. "I apologize for that," he said, helping her retrieve the book. "Willie Grant has a poor sense of everything. I've met his kind before." She accepted the book with a nod of thanks. "I'm Grace Evans. Calder Hayes." He glanced at her bag. "You really looking for work?" "Yes." She met his gaze directly. "I can cook clean so. I'm a hard worker." Calder considered her. She was clearly educated. Her speech marked her as someone with schooling, but there was something in her eyes. Wariness. The look of someone running from something. "Where are you from, Miss Evans?" "Kansas most recently." A slight hesitation. "Before that, back east." He nodded slowly. People came west for new beginnings. Or to escape old problems. He had no right to judge either. "I might have work," he said finally. "I run a cattle ranch about 3 hours' ride from here. Need help with the house cooking for the hands. And," he hesitated, "I have a daughter, 4 years old. She doesn't speak, not since her mother passed last winter." Something flickered in Grace's eyes, understanding perhaps, or recognition. "I'm sorry about your wife," she said softly. "And your daughter. I'd be happy to help however I can." "Pays not much. Room and board $10 a month." "That's fair." She nodded. "It won't be easy," he warned. "And there might be trouble. The local judge wants my land. He's making things difficult." Grace straightened her shoulders. "Mr. Hayes, I've never shied away from difficulty, and I need the work." Before Calder could respond, a new voice interrupted. "Hayes, hold up." Sheriff Tom Bishop approached, his expression grim beneath his mustache. Unlike most lawmen in frontier towns, Bishop was a decent sort, a former Union cavalry officer who'd come west to escape his own war memories. "Sheriff, Calder nodded. Got something you should see. Bishop glanced at Grace, then back to Calder. Privately. Excuse me a moment, Calder told Grace, then followed Bishop a few paces away. The sheriff pulled a folded paper from his vest. This came in yesterday's mail. Thought you should know before you hire any strangers. Calder unfolded the paper, a wanted notice from Kansas. His eyes scanned the description, then darted back to Grace Evans, who waited nervously by the boardwalk. Auburn hair, green eyes, mid-20s, last seen in Lawrence, Kansas. She's wanted for aiding a murderer, Bishop said quietly. Woman who killed her husband. Calder stared at the notice, then at Grace Evans. She met his gaze, something in her expression shifting as she saw the paper in his hand. You arresting her? Calder asked. Bishop sighed. Notice doesn't ask for arrest, just information. Besides, it's from Kansas, outside my jurisdiction. Then why show me? Because I know you're looking for help, and I figured you'd want to know who you're bringing home to your daughter. Bishop's voice softened. Be careful, Calder. You've got enough troubles without adding hers. Calder folded the paper, his mind working. The woman was clearly running from something, but so was he, in a way. Running from memories, from grief. Appreciate the warning, he said finally, but I'll make my own judgments. He returned to Grace, whose face had grown pale. Something wrong? She asked, though her tone suggested she knew exactly what Bishop had shown him. Calder studied her for a long moment. Depends. You planning on causing trouble on my ranch, Miss Evans? No, sir. Her voice was steady. I'm just looking for honest work. Then that's all I need to know. He tucked the wanted notice into his pocket. For now. Relief flickered across her face, quickly masked. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Still got a 3-hour ride ahead, and I can't promise what you'll find at the end of it will be to your liking. She picked up her carpetbag with renewed determination. I've come a long way, Mr. Hayes. A little further won't hurt me. As they walked toward his wagon, Calder couldn't shake the feeling that he was making either the best or worst decision of his life. But with Annie silent, the ranch understaffed, and Grant's men circling like vultures, he was running out of options. He helped Grace into the wagon, aware of the eyes watching from storefronts and saloon windows. By sundown, everyone in Eagles Pass would be talking about how Calder Hayes had brought home a strange woman. A wanted woman. Let them talk, he thought, grimly flicking the reins. Words were the least of his problems. The journey back to the ranch passed mostly in silence. Grace Evans wasn't one for idle chatter, it seemed, and Calder had never been much for conversation himself. The war had taught him the value of quiet, and Martha had understood that. They'd built a life around comfortable silences. As they crested the final ridge, the Hayes Ranch came into view, the main house with its stone foundation and timber upper story, the barn, the bunkhouse for the hands, the corral where a few horses grazed. Beyond stretched the pastures where his cattle roamed, and further still, the mountains that had called to his father decades ago. It's beautiful, Grace said her first words in over an hour. It is, he agreed. My father built that house when I was a boy. Said any man worth his salt needed 3 things: good land, clean water, and a solid roof. Wise man. He was. Calder flicked the reins as they began the descent. Died defending it during the war. Raiders came through, not regular army, just opportunists. He held them off long enough for my mother and sisters to escape. I'm sorry. He nodded, acknowledging her sympathy without dwelling on it. My mother and sisters moved back east after. I came home after Appomattox. Couldn't stomach cities anymore. You fought for the Union. She glanced at him. Artillery. Saw more than I care to remember. He nodded toward his left hand, where 2 fingers remained permanently curled. Got this at Antietam. Got the face at Gettysburg. She didn't press further, and he appreciated that. As they neared the house, Annie appeared on the porch, Hank just behind her. The old foreman's eyebrows rose at the sight of Grace, but he kept his peace. Annie, Calder called as he halted the wagon. Come meet Miss Evans. She's going to be helping us for a while. Annie approached cautiously, half hidden behind her doll. Her eyes were wide and curious. Grace climbed down from the wagon and knelt to Annie's level. Hello, Annie. I'm Grace. Her voice softened. That's a lovely doll you have. Annie didn't respond, but she didn't retreat either, which Calder counted as a victory. Hank stepped forward, extending a weathered hand. Hank Miller, ma'am. I run things when the boss is away. Grace Evans. She shook his hand firmly. Pleasure to meet you. Miss Evans will be helping with the house and cooking, Calder explained, unloading her bag. She'll stay in the small room off the kitchen. Hank nodded, though Calder didn't miss the questioning look in the old man's eyes. Later, he knew there would be questions. I'll show you around, Calder told Grace. Hank, can you see to the horses? Of course, boss. Calder led Grace into the house, Annie trailing behind at a careful distance. The interior was plain, but solid. A large front room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with a cast-iron stove, a dining table that could seat 8. Stairs led to the second floor, where his and Annie's rooms were located. It's not fancy, he said, suddenly aware of the dust and disorder. Martha had kept things tidy, but since her death, the house had taken on a neglected air despite his efforts. It's a home, Grace said simply. That's what matters. He showed her to the small bedroom off the kitchen, once a pantry converted to sleeping quarters years ago. It's not much, he apologized, but it's private. It's perfect. She set her bag on the narrow bed. Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Calder, he corrected. If you're going to be living here. She smiled slightly. Calder, then. He hesitated, then pulled the wanted notice from his pocket. Before we go any further, I need to know what this is about. Grace's smile faded. She took the paper, her hands remarkably steady as she read it. It's not accurate, she said, finally looking up at him. Lucy Wilson didn't murder her husband. He died in an accident while pursuing her. But you helped her escape. A nod. I did. He'd been beating her for years, her and their little girl. Her eyes flashed with sudden intensity. Would you have me do differently? Calder studied her, recognizing the steel beneath her calm exterior. No, he said finally. I wouldn't. Relief flickered across her face. I won't bring trouble to your door, Mr. Calder. I just need a fresh start. Don't we all? He folded the notice and tucked it away. Your past is your business, Miss Evans. I'm hiring you for your work, not your history. I appreciate that. She glanced around the small room. When would you like me to start? Supper, if you're not too tired from the journey. The hands will be in from the fields soon, hungry as wolves. I'll manage. She rolled up her sleeves. Is there anything I should know about feeding your men? They're not picky. Hank usually handles it, but he'd welcome the help. A small noise from the doorway drew their attention. Annie stood there watching them with solemn eyes, her doll clutched to her chest. Calder knelt, extending a hand. Come here, little one. It's all right. Annie approached cautiously, her eyes never leaving Grace. She's curious about you, Calder explained, standing with Annie's hand in his. Doesn't get to see many new faces out here. Hello again, Annie, Grace said gently. I hope we'll be friends. Annie didn't respond, but she didn't hide either. Calder counted that as progress. "I'll leave you to settle in," he said. "Kitchen's yours when you're ready." As he led Annie from the room, he caught a glimpse of Grace unpacking her few belongings. Among them was a wooden rolling pin, worn smooth with age and use. She ran her fingers over it with a look of such tenderness that Calder quickly glanced away, feeling as though he'd intruded on something private. That evening the hands returned from the fields to find a meal better than anything they'd had since Martha's passing, cornbread still warm from the oven, a hearty stew that stretched the limited meat supply, and even a simple apple cobbler. Calder watched as Grace moved confidently through the kitchen, serving the men with quiet efficiency. She wasn't talkative, but she was attentive, making sure each plate was filled, each cup replenished. The men responded with cautious appreciation, their initial wariness giving way to respect for anyone who could cook like that after a day's journey. Later, after the hands had returned to the bunkhouse and Annie was asleep upstairs, Calder found Grace washing dishes in the kitchen. "That was the best meal we've had in months," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Thank you." She glanced up a strand of auburn hair falling across her forehead. "It was nothing special, but you're welcome." The men appreciated it. So did Annie. She ate more tonight than she has in weeks. Grace's expression softened. "She's a sweet child, very observant. She was different before," he trailed off. "Before Martha died, full of chatter, always laughing." "Grief affects us all differently," Grace said quietly. "Especially children." Something in her tone made him wonder if she spoke from experience. "Well," he straightened, suddenly aware of how domestic the scene felt. "I should let you rest. It's been a long day." "Good night, Calder," she replied, turning back to the dishes. He paused at the stairs, watching her for a moment longer. There was something about Grace Evans, a quiet strength, a careful guardedness, that reminded him of the women he'd known during the war. Women who'd lost everything but kept going through sheer force of will. Whatever her past held, Calder found himself glad she had found her way to his door. That night he checked on Annie, as he always did, adjusting her blankets and brushing a kiss against her forehead. She stirred slightly. "It's all right, little one," he whispered. "Just Pa checking on you." Her eyes opened sleepy but alert. To his surprise, she pointed toward the stairs, then made a small gesture with her hands mimicking kneading dough. "Miss Evans," he guessed. "You like her?" Annie nodded solemnly. "Me too," he admitted. "But she might not stay long. People rarely do out here." Annie's expression fell. She clutched her doll tighter. "But she's here now," he added quickly. "And that's good, right?" Another nod, more enthusiastic. "Sleep tight, sweetheart." He kissed her forehead again. "Tomorrow's another day." As he closed her door, Calder couldn't help but hope that Grace Evans might be different, that she might stay. Not for himself, he told himself firmly, but for Annie. The girl needed a woman's influence, especially now. But as he entered his own bedroom and caught sight of Martha's hairbrush still on the dresser, guilt washed over him. It felt like betrayal to even consider another woman under his roof, no matter how practical the arrangement. "I'm doing what I have to," he whispered to Martha's memory. "For Annie, for the ranch." The silence that answered was profound. Dawn broke crisp and clear. Calder rose before the sun, as was his habit, dressing quietly in the dim light filtering through his window. He expected to be the first one downstairs as usual, but the scent of coffee and something baking greeted him as he descended. Grace was already in the kitchen, hair tied back, sleeves rolled up, flour dusting her hands. The stove radiated heat, and something that smelled like heaven was just emerging on a baking sheet. "Morning," she said, not turning from her work. Coffee's hot. Breakfast will be ready soon. You're up early. He poured himself a cup, black and strong. Old habits. She set the baking sheet on the counter. I was raised to believe idle hands are the devil's workshop. Fresh bread, he realized, inhaling the aroma. Not the quick biscuits Hank usually made, but proper bread with a golden crust. Smells good, he offered. She glanced at him, a hint of pride in her expression. My mother taught me. Said bread was the foundation of any good meal. She was right. He took a cautious sip of coffee, finding it better than the usual bitter brew. You didn't have to go to all this trouble. It's not trouble. It's my job. She wiped her hands on her apron. Besides, I find baking calming. Before he could respond, the back door opened and Hank entered, surprise evident on his face at finding both of them already up. Well now, the old man said, eyeing the bread. That's a sight I haven't seen in a while. Good morning, Mr. Miller, Grace greeted him. Coffee. Don't mind if I do. He accepted a cup gratefully. And it's just Hank, ma'am. No need for formalities when we're all getting up before the roosters. A comfortable routine quickly established itself. Grace cooked for the household, and the hands kept the house in order and slowly began to restore what Martha's death had taken from the Hayes home warmth care, the small touches that turned four walls into a sanctuary. Annie watched it all with solemn eyes, never speaking, but always observing. To Calder's surprise, the girl began to follow Grace around, silently helping with small tasks, fetching eggs, holding the broom, standing on a stool to watch bread being kneaded. A week passed then, too. The hands remarked that the boss seemed less grim, the house less like a tomb. Calder himself felt a tightness in his chest begin to ease, though guilt still gnawed at him in quiet moments. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. Calder was mending a fence in the south pasture when one of the younger hands, a boy named Timothy, came riding hard across the field. "Boss," the boy called, pulling his horse up short. "Riders coming." 4 of them, armed, a Calder straightened hand, going instinctively to the revolver at his hip. "Grant's men. Think so. One of 'em's Floyd Jenkins for sure." "Get back to the house," Calder ordered. "Tell Hank to get the men ready just in case. And make sure Miss Evans keeps Annie inside." The boy nodded and wheeled his horse around, galloping toward the main house. Calder mounted his own horse and rode to meet the approaching riders, intercepting them well before they reached the house. As Timothy had said, Floyd Jenkins led the group, a smirk on his weathered face. "Afternoon, Hayes," Jenkins called as they drew near. "Fine day, ain't it?" "State your business, Jenkins," Calder replied, hand resting near his gun. "You're trespassing." "Now that ain't friendly," Jenkins signaled his men to halt. "We're just delivering a message from Judge Grant. Not interested." "Oh, you'll want to hear this one." Jenkins pulled a folded document from his coat. "Judge has decided to be generous. Offers now $700 for the whole spread. That's a fair price." "Land's not for sale," Calder repeated. "Never will be." Jenkins's smile turned cold. "Judge figured you'd say that. That's why he asked me to give you this, too." He extended a second piece of paper. Calder took it warily, unfolding it with one hand, while keeping the other near his weapon. As he read, his blood ran cold. It was a notice of audit from the Territorial Tax Office citing irregularities in the Hayes Ranch property assessment. According to the document, Calder owed back taxes amounting to over $500 due within 30 days. "This is false," he said, voice dangerously quiet. "My taxes are paid." Jenkins shrugged. "Take it up with the Territorial Office. Oh, wait, Judge Grant's brother is the tax assessor. His smirk widened. Funny coincidence, ain't it? Calder crumpled the paper in his fist. Get off my land, Jenkins. Now. Sure thing, Hayes. Just remember, $700 would clear those taxes with money to spare. Enough to start fresh somewhere else. Jenkins tipped his hat mockingly. With your daughter. And your pretty new housekeeper. The mention of Grace and Annie sent a surge of protective rage through Calder. He drew his revolver in one fluid motion, aiming it squarely at Jenkins's chest. You threaten my family again, he said, each word precise, and they won't find enough of you to bury. Jenkins's smile faltered. Easy now, Hayes. Just delivering a message. Message delivered. Now get out. The four men backed their horses away slowly, Jenkins maintaining eye contact, until they turned and rode off toward the boundary. Calder watched them go, his grip tight on the revolver. The tax notice was a clever move, legal on the surface, corrupt at its core. Just like everything Edward Grant touched. When he returned to the house, he found Hank and the hands armed and waiting. Grace standing on the porch with Annie half hidden behind her skirts. Everything all right, boss? Hank called. For now. Calder dismounted, tucking the crumpled notice into his pocket. Back to work, everyone. Show's over. The men dispersed reluctantly. Grace remained on the porch, her expression concerned. What did they want? She asked as he approached. Same as always, the land. He didn't mention the tax notice. No need to worry her yet. Annie peeked out from behind Grace, her eyes wide. Calder knelt, forcing a smile. Everything's fine, little one. Just some men asking directions. Annie's expression said clearly that she didn't believe him. Smart child, just like her mother. Why don't you help Miss Evans with dinner? He suggested. I need to talk to Hank for a bit. Annie nodded solemnly and took Grace's hand. As they turned to go inside, Grace looked back, her green eyes meeting Calder's. Be careful, Calder, she said softly. Whatever it is. He nodded, struck by the genuine concern in her voice. It had been a long time since anyone but Hank had worried about him. Later, after Annie was asleep, Calder sat at the kitchen table with Hank, the tax notice spread between them alongside a bottle of whiskey. It's a dirty trick, Hank growled, but effective. Even if you fought it in court, the judge would be Grant himself. I know. Calder stared at the paper. And I don't have $500. Not with what we've lost in the drought. Could take out a loan. From Grant's bank, might as well sign over the deed now. They sat in silence, the gravity of the situation weighing on them both. There might be another way, Hank said finally. I've got some savings. Not much, but no. Calder's tone was final. I'm not taking your money, Hank. You've earned every penny. This land means as much to me as it does to you, the old man protested. I helped your father build it. And I won't repay that by taking your life savings. Calder poured them each another drink. I'll find another way. A soft noise from the doorway made them both look up. Grace stood there, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. I'm sorry, she said. I couldn't sleep. I didn't mean to intrude. It's all right, Calder said, too tired to maintain pretenses. We're just discussing Judge Grant's latest move against us. She hesitated, then approached the table. May I? She asked, gesturing to the notice. Calder nodded, and she picked it up, reading it carefully. This is clearly fraudulent, she said after a moment. The amounts don't even add up correctly. Doesn't matter if it's legal when Grant controls the courts, Hank pointed out. Grace's brow furrowed. There must be someone above him. A circuit judge, perhaps? Or the territorial governor? Denver's a long way, Calder said, and Grant has friends there, too. She set the paper down, her expression thoughtful. My father He always said that corruption thrives in darkness, that the only way to fight it is to bring it to light. "Your father sounds like a wise man," Hank observed. A shadow crossed her face. "He was, in some ways." She looked at Calder. "Is there anyone in town who might stand against Grant? Anyone with influence?" Calder considered. "Doc Wilson has some standing. Sheriff Bishop tries to be fair, though his hands are tied. Mrs. Smith at the general store, she's respected." "That's a start," Grace said. "Perhaps if enough people spoke up." "They're all afraid." Calder shook his head. "Can't blame them. Fear is a powerful motivator," she agreed. "But so is justice." She straightened. "I should let you men talk. Good night." After she left, Hank gave Calder a meaningful look. "She's got spirit, that one," the old man said. "Reminds me of Martha in a way, not afraid to speak her mind." "She's nothing like Martha," Calder said sharply, then sighed. "Sorry. Martha was born to this life. Miss Evans is just passing through." "Maybe." Hank rose, his joints creaking. "Maybe not. Either way, she cares what happens to you and Annie. That counts for something in my book." After Hank retired to the bunkhouse, Calder remained at the table. The tax notice before him, his thoughts in turmoil. $500 might as well be $5,000. The drought had hit them hard. Cattle prices were down, and most of his savings had gone to bury Martha and keep the ranch afloat afterward. He could sell some of the herd, but that would leave them vulnerable next season. Sell off a piece of land, but that would only encourage Grant to push harder. Absently, he fingered the scar on his cheek. He'd faced worse odds in the war, outgunned, outmanned, but still standing when the smoke cleared. This was just another battle, one he couldn't afford to lose. Outside, the wind picked up, moaning around the eaves like a lost soul. A storm was coming, both literally and figuratively. Calder could only hope they were strong enough to weather it. As he finally climbed the stairs to his empty bed, he paused at Annie's door, pushing it open gently to check on her. She slept peacefully, her doll clutched to her chest, untroubled by the adult concerns that weighed on him. "I'll keep you safe," he whispered. "Whatever it takes." He closed her door quietly and continued to his room, unaware that down the hall Grace Evans sat by her small window, watching the storm clouds gather, her fingers tracing the worn surface of her mother's rolling pin as she made her own silent vow. In the darkness of his room, Calder unfolded the wanted notice from Kansas once more, studying Grace Evans's description by moonlight. Whatever she was running from it had brought her here to his door at precisely the moment he needed help. Coincidence or providence? Either way, as he finally drifted toward sleep, Calder found himself grateful for her presence, not just for the practical help she provided, but for the quiet strength she brought to a house that had been drowning in silence for too long. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But for tonight, the Hayes Ranch stood firm against the gathering storm, its inhabitants finding what comfort they could in the eye of the hurricane that was yet to come. The morning after Jenkins's visit, Calder rose before dawn to find Grace already in the kitchen, kneading dough with practiced motions. Her sleeves were rolled up flour, dusting her forearms, her auburn hair secured in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. "You're up early," he observed, pouring himself coffee. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted, without pausing her work. "Thought I might as well make myself useful." Calder watched her hands as they worked the dough, steady, methodical, almost meditative. "What are you making?" "Bread for the men, biscuits for breakfast." She glanced up. "And something special for Annie." He raised an eyebrow. "Special?" A hint of a smile touched her lips. "My mother used to make small bread horses when I was upset. Said they had magic in them." "Did it work?" "Every time." The smile reached her eyes briefly, then faded. "I thought Annie might like one." Calder nodded, oddly touched. "That's kind of you." "It's nothing." She returned to her kneading. "I noticed she watches me when I bake. Seems interested." Before he could respond, Hank entered stamping mud from his boots. "Storm's picked up," the foreman announced. "Creek's rising fast." "How bad?" Calder set down his coffee. "Bad enough. South pasture's already flooding. We need to move the herd to higher ground before we lose any." Calder cursed under his breath. "Get the men ready. I'll be right out." As Hank left, Calder turned back to Grace. "I may be gone most of the day. Will you be all right with Annie?" "Of course." She wiped her hands on her apron. "Don't worry about us. Just be careful out there." The genuine concern in her voice caught him off guard. "Always am," he said gruffly, then paused at the door. "That tax notice. I'd appreciate if you didn't mention it to Annie. She worries enough." "I wouldn't dream of it." Grace's expression was solemn. "Some burdens aren't for children to bear." With a nod of gratitude, Calder headed out into the storm. The day proved brutal. Rain lashed down in sheets, turning the pastures to mud and the creek into a raging torrent. Calder and his men worked tirelessly, driving the cattle to higher ground, rescuing calves from rising waters, reinforcing fences against the onslaught. By mid-afternoon, they'd saved most of the herd, but Calder was soaked to the skin, his hands, raw muscles aching. The rain showed no sign of abating. "Boss!" Timothy shouted over the downpour. "Fence on the east side's down, water's taking it out." Cursing, Calder spurred his horse toward the east pasture. If that fence went half, their remaining cattle would scatter across the territory. As he crested the rise, his heart sank. The normally placid creek had become a monster, brown and churning, tearing at the land. A section of fence had already collapsed, and water poured through the gap, carving a new channel directly toward the lower pastures. For hours, they fought the flood, piling sandbags, driving stakes, diverting the flow where they could. The rain continued relentlessly, as if nature itself had allied with Judge Grant against them. It was nearly dusk when Calder finally called a halt. They'd saved what they could. The rest was in God's hands. "Get back to the bunkhouse," he told his exhausted men. "Dry off, get warm. You've earned it." He remained a moment longer, surveying the damage in the fading light. The storm had cost them at least a dozen cattle lost to the flood, acres of pasture, underwater fences demolished. Repairs would be expensive, and with the tax demand hanging over them. Wearily he turned his horse toward home, the animal picking its way carefully through the mud. As the house came into view, a warm light glowed from the kitchen windows, smoke curling from the chimney despite the rain. The sight eased something in his chest. Inside, he found Grace at the stove, stirring a pot of something that smelled like heaven to a man who'd missed lunch. Annie sat at the table, surprisingly arranging small figures made of baked dough horses, stars, a lopsided bird. "You're back," Grace said, relief evident in her voice. "I was getting worried." "Creek flooded," he explained, shrugging off his sodden coat. "Lost some cattle, but saved most." Annie slid from her chair and approached her small face concerned as she took in his bedraggled state. To his surprise, she tugged at his hand, pulling him toward the chair she'd vacated. "I think she wants you to sit," Grace interpreted, hiding a smile. "Yes, ma'am," he said to Annie, who nodded seriously. As he sank into the chair, Grace placed a steaming mug of coffee before him, fortified with something stronger. "Medicinal," she explained with a wink. "For the chill." The warmth of the kitchen, the smell of food, Annie's solemn presence. It created an illusion of normalcy that Calder hadn't realized he'd been missing. For a moment, He could almost forget the tax notice, the flood, the constant battle to keep what was his. Grace set a bowl of stew before him, thick with vegetables and what little meat they could spare. "Eat," she encouraged. "You look half drowned." He didn't need to be told twice. As he ate, Annie pushed one of her dough figures toward him, a rough approximation of a horse. "Did you make this?" he asked her. She nodded, pride evident in her small face. "It's a fine horse," he said seriously. "Reminds me of Old Thunder." Annie's eyes lit up at the mention of his stallion. She mimicked riding her first animation in days. "That's right," he agreed. "Fast as lightning." Grace watched their interaction, a soft expression on her face that she quickly masked when Calder glanced her way. "Annie's been helping me all day," she said, turning back to the stove. "She has quite a talent for baking." Annie beamed at the praise, then yawned widely. "Someone's ready for bed," Calder observed. "It's been a long day for all of us." "I'll take her up," Grace offered. "No need. It's my job." He stood extending his hand to Annie. "Come on, little one. Time for sleep." As he led Annie upstairs, Calder was struck by how easily Grace had slipped into their lives. 3 weeks ago she'd been a stranger. Now it felt as if she'd always been there, moving through their home with quiet confidence, bringing order to chaos, warmth to cold corners. It was dangerous, this growing dependence. Dangerous because she could leave as suddenly as she'd arrived. Dangerous because Annie was becoming attached. Dangerous because if he was honest with himself, so was he. After settling Annie in bed with a story, Calder returned downstairs to find Grace washing dishes, her back to him. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for today, for looking after Annie." She glanced over her shoulder. "It's why you hired me." "Still, it means a lot." He hesitated. "She seems happier with you here." Grace's hands stilled. "She's a special child, very perceptive. Like her mother." The words slipped out before he could stop them. Grace turned fully, drying her hands on her apron. "Tell me about her, Martha, I mean, if you don't mind." Calder leaned against the doorframe, surprised by the request, but not unwilling. "She was strong, determined, could outride most men, and still look like a lady doing it." A faint smile touched his lips. "Never raised her voice, but everyone listened when she spoke." "She sounds remarkable." She was. He looked down at his wedding band, still present after a year. "We met during the war. She was a nurse in a field hospital near Richmond. Patched me up after Gettysburg." "Is that where—" Grace gestured vaguely toward his scarred cheek. He nodded. "Shrapnel. She said it gave me character." The memory ached, but less sharply than usual. "After the war, when I came back here, she followed. Said she'd fallen in love with my letters, not my face. A wise woman. Wiser than me, that's certain." He sighed. "She built this place into a home. Knew everyone for miles, helped with births and deaths, kept the books better than any banker." His voice roughened. "When she died last winter, it was like the heart went out of everything." Grace's eyes held understanding, not pity. "Grief has its own timeline. You can't rush it." "No," he agreed. "But life doesn't stop for grieving, does it? The ranch needs running. Annie needs raising." He straightened. "And Grant needs stopping." "About that." Grace's expression turned serious. "I've been thinking about your situation. The tax notice." "Oh. You need allies. People in town who might stand with you against Grant. Told you last night they're all afraid." "Fear can be overcome," she countered, "especially when people realize they're not alone." Calder studied her. You sound like you've done this before. Something flickered in her eyes. Caution, perhaps. Let's just say I've seen what happens when good people stay silent in the face of injustice. And what happens when they don't? Sometimes they win. She folded her arms. You're not the first person Grant has tried to push out, are you? No, he admitted. The Wilsons lost their place last year. The Hendersons before that. All for the railroad that Grant's investors want to build through here. Then others have reason to stand with you. She leaned forward, earnest. You need to go into town. Talk to people. Build a coalition. Calder shook his head. These are ranchers and farmers, not politicians. They're people with something to lose, Grace insisted. Just like you. And together, you might have a chance. Before he could respond, a pounding at the door interrupted them. Calder's hand went instinctively to his sidearm as he moved to answer. Hank stood on the porch, rain streaming from his hat. Boss, we got trouble. Riders coming up the North Road. Grant's men don't think so. Moving too careful, like they're scouting. Calder grabbed his coat. How many? 3, maybe 4, hard to tell in this rain. Get the men armed. I'll check it out. Grace had appeared in the hallway, her expression concerned. What's happening? Probably nothing, Calder assured her, checking his revolver. But stay inside. Keep Annie upstairs. He stepped out into the storm rain, immediately soaking through his barely dried clothes. The night was pitch-black, visibility limited to a few yards beyond the lantern Hank carried. They were moving along the ridge, Hank said, pointing. Like they were mapping the property line. Calder nodded grimly. Surveyors, most likely. For Grant's railroad. They saddled horses quickly, Calder taking his Winchester from its place above the door. 2 of the hands joined them, armed with shotguns. We'll head up to the North Ridge, Calder instructed. Fan out, but stay within shouting distance. If they're just passing through, we let them go. If they're on Hayes land, we escort them off. No shooting, unless they start it. The men nodded, faces grim in the lantern light. For nearly an hour they searched the rain, obscuring tracks and sounds alike. Just as Calder was about to call it off, a flicker of light caught his eye. A lantern quickly extinguished near the old boundary marker his father had placed decades ago. He signaled to Hank, and they approached cautiously, rifles ready. 3 men huddled beneath a makeshift shelter of canvas maps spread before them, despite the rain. One held a surveyor's transit, another scribbled notes. They were so engrossed in their work, they didn't notice Calder until his horse was nearly upon them. Evening, gentlemen, he said, Winchester leveled. You're trespassing on Hayes property. The men froze, hands instinctively rising. The oldest, a thin man with spectacles, recovered first. Mr. Hayes, I presume, we're simply conducting a survey for the territorial government. At night, in a storm, Calder's tone was skeptical. Try again. The surveyor cleared his throat nervously. Perhaps I should be more specific. We're surveying for the Colorado Eastern Railroad. We have all the proper permissions. Not from me, Calder cut him off. And this is my land. Actually, the man fumbled with his papers, producing a document. According to the territorial office, this section is under dispute due to tax irregularities. Judge Grant has authorized a preliminary survey for potential right-of-way. Calder's jaw tightened. Grant had moved faster than expected, already positioning for the seizure. Tax dispute or not, this land belongs to Hayes Ranch until a court says otherwise. He gestured with the rifle. Pack up. You're leaving. The surveyors exchanged glances, clearly weighing their options. Finally, the oldest nodded. Very well, Mr. Hayes. We'll withdraw for now. He began gathering his papers. But Judge Grant won't be pleased. Judge Grant's pleasure isn't my concern. As the men packed their equipment, the youngest, barely more than a boy, glanced up at Calder nervously. "Sir, if I might say, the judge is determined to have this land. He told Mr. Whitaker the railroads already approved the route." "Tommy," the oldest surveyor hissed. "Hold your tongue. Let the boy speak," Calder said, eyes narrowing. "What else did Grant say?" Tommy swallowed hard. "Just that there were ways to persuade difficult sellers, that sometimes accidents happen to those who stand in the way of progress." "That sounds like a threat," Hank growled. "It's just talk," the older surveyor insisted, shooting Tommy a warning look. "The judge likes to sound important." "He's more than talk," Calder countered. "Ask the Millers about their accidental fire." The men fell silent at that, hastily finishing their packing. Calder and his men escorted them to the property line, watching until they disappeared into the rainy darkness. "They'll be back," Hank said grimly. "With more than maps next time," Calder agreed. "We need to be ready." When they returned to the ranch, Calder was surprised to find Grace still awake, pacing the kitchen. She looked up as he entered, relief washing over her face. "You're back," she said. "I was worried." "Just Grant's surveyors," he explained, hanging his dripping coat. "Mapping for the railroad. So soon, before any legal proceedings. Grant doesn't wait for the law. He shapes it to his needs." Calder sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. "He's already acting like this land is his." Grace poured him coffee laced with whiskey, just as before. "Then we need to move quickly," she said, sitting across from him, "before he gains more ground. She met his gaze steadily. "Yes, I work here. This concerns me too." The simple declaration warmed him more than the coffee. "Appreciate the sentiment, Miss Evans, but this isn't your fight." "I choose my own fights, Mr. Hayes." A hint of steel entered her voice. "And I don't abandon people who need help." Calder studied her, sensing there was more to her words than a simple employment loyalty. "Because of what happened in Kansas." She tensed slightly, then nodded. "Lucy Wilson and her daughter needed help. I gave it. I'd do the same again regardless of the consequences." "Even though it made you a fugitive." "I'm not a fugitive," she corrected. "I'm a witness to injustice. There's a difference. Not to the law. The law isn't always just." Her green eyes flashed with conviction. "As you well know, given your current situation." He couldn't argue with that. Fair point. But getting involved with my troubles could bring attention you don't want. "I can handle attention," she said simply. "The question is, will you accept help when it's offered?" Calder found himself at a crossroads. Pride urged him to handle Grant alone, as he'd handled every challenge since Martha's death. But pragmatism whispered that allies were essential in this fight, and Grace Evans had already proven herself resourceful and steadfast. "All right," he said finally. "What do you suggest?" Relief flickered across her face. "First, we need to know exactly who in town might stand with you. Not just who's afraid of Grant, but who has reason to resent him." "That's most everyone," Calder said dryly. "But fear trumps resentment." "Not always." She leaned forward. "You mentioned Doc Wilson and Sheriff Bishop. Are there others, former victims of Grant's schemes, who might welcome a chance at justice?" Calder considered. "The Millers, Hank's cousins, lost their place to a tax dispute last month. Jacob Henderson, same story last year. Samuel Wright lost his store when Grant called in a loan suddenly." "That's a start," Grace nodded. "And the sheriff, you said he tries to be fair. Bishop's a good man in a bad position." Elected by the people, but the jail and his salary come from the county which Grant controls. But if enough people stood with him, maybe. Calder wasn't convinced. Grant has guns too, don't forget. Men like Jenkins who enjoy using them. Violence should be the last resort, Grace said firmly. Sometimes it's the only one. Calder's hand went unconsciously to his scarred cheek. I learned that in the war. War taught me different lessons, she countered. That might doesn't make right. That ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they stand together. You were in the war, he asked, surprised. A shadow crossed her face. My father was a chaplain with the 20th Maine. I worked in the field hospitals, saw things no one should see. Understanding dawned. That's how you know about wounds, about grief. She nodded, eyes distant. I've held the hands of dying boys younger than your ranch hands. Watched good men make impossible choices. Her gaze refocused on him. That's why I know this fight with Grant can be won. I've seen harder battles won with less. Calder found himself believing her not just out of desperation, but because of the quiet certainty in her voice. She spoke not as an idealist, but as someone who had witnessed both the worst and best of humanity. All right, he said finally. We'll try it your way first. I'll ride into town tomorrow, speak with Doc Wilson and the others. I'm coming with you. He started to protest, then thought better of it. Fine, but Annie stays here with Hank. Agreed. She rose, gathering their empty cups. Get some rest, Calder. Tomorrow will be a long day. As she turned toward the sink, he caught her arm gently. Thank you. Not many would involve themselves in another's troubles. Something complicated passed through her eyes, determination perhaps, or old pain. We all need someone to stand with us sometimes, she said softly. Even the strongest among us. The simple truth of her words stayed with him as he climbed the stairs to check on Annie. The girl slept peacefully, the little doe horse clutched in her hand, instead of her usual doll. The sight brought an unexpected lump to his throat. In his own room, Calder sat on the edge of the bed, turning his wedding band slowly. I'm trying, Martha, he whispered to the empty air. God knows I'm trying. For the first time in months, he thought he felt not reproach from her memory, but approval. Or perhaps it was simply exhaustion clouding his mind. Either way, as sleep finally claimed him, Calder Hayes felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. The next morning dawned clear, the storm having blown itself out overnight. Calder and Grace set out for Eagle's Pass after breakfast, leaving Annie in Hank's capable care. The girl had seemed distressed at their departure until Grace pressed another doe figure into her hands, this time a star, and whispered something that made Annie nod solemnly. They rode in companionable silence for the first hour, the muddy road demanding their attention. Grace sat her horse with the ease of someone raised around them, another surprising skill from the preacher's daughter. Your father taught you to ride? Calder asked, breaking the silence. My grandfather, she corrected. He had a small farm in Vermont before they moved west. Said every child should know horses and hard work. Wise man. He was. A fond smile touched her lips. My father was more concerned with books and sermons. Grandfather was the practical one. And your mother, the one who taught you to bake. She found balance between them, faith and practicality. Grace's expression softened. She believed God existed in small kindnesses as much as in grand cathedrals. Sounds like someone Martha would have liked, Calder observed. I think I would have liked her too, Grace said quietly. From what you've said. The simple statement hung between them, acknowledging Martha's absence without minimizing it. Calder found it oddly comforting. As they approached Eagles Pass, he outlined their strategy. "We'll start with Doc Wilson. His office is at the edge of town, less conspicuous. If Grant's watching, and he probably is, it'll look like a routine visit." Grace nodded. "And the others?" "One at a time. Casual. Like we're just running errands." He glanced at her. "You should probably handle Mrs. Smith at the general store. Woman to woman." "Agreed." She adjusted her bonnet. "What about Sheriff Bishop?" "Last, and carefully. His office is right across from the courthouse, Grant's domain." They entered town from the east, avoiding Main Street initially. Dr. James Wilson's small practice occupied the ground floor of a modest two-story building, his residence above. A weathered sign promised medical care and discretion. The doctor himself answered Calder's knock, a man in his 50s, with silver hair and shrewd eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. His expression brightened at the sight of Calder. "Hayes, good to see you." His gaze shifted to Grace, curious, but not judgmental. "And who might this be?" "Grace Evans, my housekeeper," Calder introduced. "Miss Evans, this is Dr. Wilson." "A pleasure, Doctor," Grace said, offering her hand. "Likewise." Wilson shook it, then ushered them inside. Come in, come in. What brings you to town?" "Not Annie, I hope." "Annie's fine," Calder assured him as they entered the doctor's cluttered office. "Still not speaking, but otherwise healthy." "Good, good." Wilson closed the door behind them, lowering his voice. "Though I suspect this isn't a social call, given recent events." Calder raised an eyebrow. "You've heard about the tax notice the surveyors—" Wilson snorted. "Small towns have big ears, my friend. Plus, Grant's been particularly smug lately." "Then you know what he's trying to do." "Same thing he's done to others." Wilson gestured for them to sit. "Though he seems especially determined in your case. Something about the water rights, I believe." "Eagle Creek," Calder confirmed, "controls water for half the county. Essential for the railroad he's backing." Wilson nodded grimly. "I treated Tom Miller after the accident at their place. Burns on 20% of his body. He told me it was Grant's men who set the fire." "Did he report it?" Grace asked. "To whom Sheriff Bishop tries, but his hands are tied. Judge Grant is the law here." Wilson's eyes narrowed. "But I'm guessing you're not here just to confirm what you already know." "No." Calder leaned forward. "We're looking for allies. People willing to stand against Grant." Wilson's eyebrows rose. "Bold move. And dangerous." "More dangerous to do nothing," Grace interjected. "If Grant succeeds with Mr. Hayes, who's next? Your practice, your home." The doctor studied her with new interest. "You speak plainly, Miss Evans." "Plainly is the only way to speak about injustice," she replied. A slow smile spread across Wilson's face. "Martha would have liked you," he said unknowingly, echoing Calder's earlier thought. Then to Calder, "She's right, of course. Grant's appetite grows with each victory. Sooner or later, he'll come for anyone with anything worth taking." "Then you'll help us?" Calder asked. "I've been waiting for someone with the courage to lead the charge," Wilson admitted. "Count me in. Though what exactly I can do—" "Information for now," Grace suggested. "Names of others who might join us. Evidence of Grant's corruption, if you have any." "Both I can provide." Wilson moved to his desk, unlocking a drawer. "I've been keeping records of Grant's accidents injuries that align suspiciously with property transfers. Nothing that would stand up in court alone, but together with other evidence." "It's a start," Calder said, hope kindling. Wilson handed him a small notebook. "Names and dates. Keep it safe." His expression turned grave. Be careful who else you approach. Grant has eyes everywhere." "We will," Calder promised, tucking the notebook into his coat. "Thank you, Doc." "Don't thank me yet," Wilson warned. "This won't be easy, and it certainly won't be quick." "Few worthwhile things are," Grace said simply. They left Wilson's office with renewed purpose, proceeding to their next stop. Henderson's livery, where Jacob Henderson had rebuilt after losing his ranch to Grant's machinations. Henderson proved a harder sell. A burly man with a permanent scowl, he listened to Calder's proposition with growing skepticism. "You're asking me to put my new business on the line," he growled, "after losing everything once already." "I'm asking you to help ensure it doesn't happen again," Calder countered, "to anyone." "Easy for you to say. You still have something to lose." "Which is why I'm fighting," Calder said evenly, "before it's gone." Henderson spat tobacco juice into the straw. "And what exactly is your plan? March into Grant's office and demand justice. He has the law, the money, and the guns." "We're gathering evidence," Grace explained, "building a case to take to the territorial governor." "Evidence?" Henderson laughed bitterly. "Against a judge, good luck with that." "Dr. Wilson is helping," Calder said. "We're hoping Mrs. Smith will too, and Sheriff Bishop." That gave Henderson pause. "Bishop, he's a straight arrow, but he's caught between his badge and Grant's pocket." "If enough people stand with him, he might find his courage," Grace suggested. Henderson studied them both, weighing risk against possibility. Finally, he grunted. "I won't make promises, but if you get others on board, real support, not just talk, come see me again." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Calder counted it as progress. Their next stop was the general store where they split up. Calder browsed supplies, while Grace engaged Mrs. Smith in conversation. From his position by the ammunition display, he could see the two women's heads bent close, their voices too low to hear. Mrs. Smith's expression shifted from surprise to concern to determination as Grace spoke. When Grace rejoined him, there was quiet triumph in her eyes. "She's with us," she murmured. "Her husband was a judge before the war. She knows law better than most lawyers, she claims." "That's 3, Calder said as they exited the store. 4 counting Henderson as a maybe." "More than you had yesterday," Grace pointed out. "And Mrs. Smith says there are others shopkeepers Grant has squeezed with special taxes, farmers whose water access he's threatened to cut off. Still not enough to challenge him directly." "No," she agreed, "but enough to start building a case." She nodded toward the sheriff's office across the street. "Shall we?" Calder hesitated, eyeing the courthouse next door where Judge Grant's office occupied the second floor. "Maybe we should split up for this one. Less conspicuous." "Good idea. I'll visit the dressmaker's shop. Mrs. Smith suggested the owner might be sympathetic to our cause. You speak with the sheriff." They agreed to meet at the livery in 1 hour, and Grace departed with a reassuring smile. Calder watched her go, struck by her natural ability to put people at ease, a valuable skill in their current endeavor. Crossing to the sheriff's office, Calder maintained a casual pace, tipping his hat to passers-by, as if on routine business. Sheriff Tom Bishop was alone when he entered bent over paperwork at his desk. "Hayes," Bishop looked up, surprise evident. "Didn't expect to see you in town so soon after our last conversation." "Needed supplies," Calder said easily, closing the door behind him. "Thought I'd stop by, see if there were any developments about that notice from Kansas." Understanding flickered in Bishop's eyes. "Nothing new," he said, playing along. "But please have a seat." Once Calder was seated, Bishop lowered his voice. "Jenkins and his boys were bragging at the saloon last night. said they ran your surveyors off with gunfire. Not quite, Calder corrected. But I did escort them off my property. Grant's moving fast, trying to map for the railroad before he's even secured the land. That sounds like him. Always a step ahead. Bishop rubbed his mustache. I heard about the tax notice, too. Dirty trick. One of many, Calder agreed, which is why I'm here. We're gathering evidence of Grant's corruption, building a case for the territorial governor. Bishop's eyebrows shot up. We? Myself, Doc Wilson, Mrs. Smith. Others, hopefully. Calder leaned forward. Including you, if you're willing. Me. Bishop's laugh held no humor. Hayes, I'm the sheriff. I can't openly oppose a judge. You're sworn to uphold the law, Calder reminded him. All of it, not just the parts Grant approves. Bishop's expression turned troubled. It's not that simple. Grant controls the county funds, my deputy's salary, the jail budget. And if he's removed, if a new judge is appointed, that's a big if, Bishop countered. Grant has connections in Denver, friends in the territorial legislature. So do others, Calder said, though in truth he wasn't sure who those others might be. The point is, change is possible, but only if good men are willing to act. Bishop stared at his badge lying on the desk between them. I've tried to walk the line, he said quietly. Enforce the law fairly without crossing Grant. But lately, he shook his head. The Miller's fire, the way he's targeting you, it's getting worse. Then help us stop it, Calder urged. You have access to records, witness statements, things that could prove what he's doing. The sheriff was silent for a long moment, conflict evident on his face. Finally, he sighed. I can't promise anything official, not yet, but... He lowered his voice further. There's a register of property transfers in the county clerk's office. Shows who bought the land Grant seized through tax enforcement. Might be interesting to see how many of those buyers connect to the railroad. Calder's pulse quickened. Can you get access to it? Maybe. The clerk owes me a favor. Bishop straightened as footsteps passed outside his window. But this conversation never happened. Understand, I've got a family to think about. Understood. Calder stood, extending his hand. Thank you, Sheriff. Bishop shook it firmly. Don't thank me yet. And watch your back, Hayes. Grant has eyes everywhere. The warning proved prophetic. As Calder exited the sheriff's office, he spotted Willie Grant leaning against a hitching post across the street, watching him with unconcealed interest. The young man pushed off the post and sauntered over, his customary smirk in place. Hayes, he drawled, twice in 1 month. To what do we owe the pleasure problems at the ranch? Nothing I can't handle, Calder replied evenly. Really? That's not what the tax assessor says. Willie's smirk widened. Heard you've got quite a bill coming due. Shame about that. Is there something you want, Grant? I've got business to attend to. Just being neighborly. Willie glanced toward the dressmaker's shop where Grace could be seen through the window. Checking on your housekeeper? Is it Father's been curious about her? Says she looks familiar somehow. A chill ran down Calder's spine, but he kept his expression neutral. Miss Evans is a private citizen. Your father's interest in her is inappropriate. Is it? Willie's eyes narrowed. See, I've been thinking about where I might have seen her before. Then it hit me. There was a girl in Kansas, Lawrence specifically, preacher's daughter, caused quite a scandal helping a murderess escape justice. Calder's hand instinctively moved toward his gun, but he checked himself. Sounds like you've been drinking early today, Grant. Miss Evans is from back east. Is that what she told you? Willie laughed. You might want to ask her about Lucy Wilson. about the man who died, about why she ran. Before Calder could respond, the courthouse door opened and Judge Edward Grant himself emerged. A tall, imposing figure in a black coat, his silver hair and beard immaculately groomed. He paused on the steps, gaze fixing on Calder with cold calculation. "Mr. Hayes," he called, "what a coincidence. I was just discussing your property with the county assessor." "I'm sure you were," Calder replied, maintaining his composure, despite the anger building within him. Judge Grant descended the steps, his movements deliberate, confident. At 60, he carried himself with the authority of a man accustomed to obedience. $500 is a substantial sum, Grant observed, coming to stand beside his son. "Especially for a ranch suffering from drought and poor management, since your wife's unfortunate passing." The casual mention of Martha sent hot rage through Calder's veins, but he held it in check. "My taxes were paid in full, as they always are. Your assessment is false, and we both know it." "Such accusations?" Grant tutted. "I merely enforce the territorial code, Mr. Hayes. If you feel there's been an error, you're welcome to appeal." His smile was razor-thin. "To my court, of course." "Of course," Calder echoed, the bitter irony not lost on him. "Alternatively," Grant continued smoothly, "my offer of $700 for the property stands. More than generous, considering the circumstances. The land isn't for sale." "Everything is for sale, Mr. Hayes. It's simply a matter of finding the right price." Grant's eyes hardened. "Or the right pressure." The threat hung in the air between them undisguised. "Is that how you sleep at night, Grant?" Calder asked quietly. "Telling yourself it's just business when you steal people's homes, when you burn them out if they refuse?" Willie tensed, but Judge Grant merely raised an eyebrow. "Serious accusations, Mr. Hayes. Without evidence, I might add. The kind that could be construed as defamation of a judicial officer." "The truth isn't defamation." "Truth requires proof," Grant countered. "Something you conspicuously lack." He adjusted his coat. "Consider my offer, Hayes. You have a young daughter to think about. Would be a shame if your stubbornness left her without a father as well as a mother." It took every ounce of Calder's self-control not to strike the man where he stood. Instead, he said, voice dangerously quiet, "Threaten my family again, and you'll learn exactly what I'm capable of, judge or not." Grant's smile never wavered. "Good day, Mr. Hayes. I look forward to your decision. By the end of the month, as the notice stipulates." With a nod to his son, Grant turned and walked toward the saloon, leaving Willie to deliver a final smirk before following. Calder stood rooted to the spot, rage and helplessness warring within him. The confrontation had confirmed what he already knew. Grant wouldn't stop until he had the Hayes Ranch by any means necessary. The sight of Grace exiting the dressmaker's shop pulled him from his dark thoughts. She approached quickly, concern evident in her expression. "I saw you speaking with the Grants," she said as she reached him. "Are you all right?" "Fine," he lied, then amended, "No, not fine, but intact." Her eyes searched his face. What did they say? The usual threats, thinly veiled. He glanced around, aware of eyes watching from storefronts. "We shouldn't talk here. Too many ears." They collected their horses from the livery Henderson, giving them a nod that seemed more respectful than his earlier dismissal. As they rode out of town, Calder kept a careful watch behind them, alert for any followers. Only when they were well beyond the town limits did he relate the conversation with Grant, and Willie's pointed references to Grace's past. "He knows," she said quietly when he finished. "Or suspects, at least." "Seems that way," Calder agreed. "Which means you could be in danger too." She straightened in her saddle. I'm not afraid of Willie Grant. You should be afraid of his father, Calder warned. The judge is the real threat. All the more reason to continue gathering allies, she insisted. What did Sheriff Bishop say? Calder shared the sheriff's cautious support and the mention of the property register. If we could get evidence of Grant's connection to the railroad investors, that would prove his personal interest in seizing your land. Grace nodded. Mrs. Smith mentioned something similar, that Grant always seems to know which properties the railroad will need before the plans are made public. Inside information, Calder concluded, probably getting a cut of the profits, too. The dressmaker, Mrs. Landry, confirmed it. Her cousin works for the land office in Denver. Says Grant's name appears on several railroad holding companies, though carefully disguised. Calder whistled low. That's the kind of evidence we need, but how to prove it officially? Mrs. Smith suggested writing to her late husband's colleague, a federal judge in Denver. If we can present enough evidence to warrant an investigation, it could work. Calder allowed hope kindling despite his caution. But it would take time. The tax deadline is less than 3 weeks away. Then we work quickly, Grace said with simple determination, and we prepare for whatever comes. As they rode in silence for a while, Calder's thoughts turned to Willie's allegations. Finally, he asked what really happened in Kansas with Lucy Wilson. Grace didn't pretend to misunderstand. Much as I told you, her husband beat her regularly. The last time he threatened to kill their daughter, too. I helped them escape from Lawrence, hid them in my father's church, while arrangements were made for them to travel west. And the husband tracked us to the church. He was drunk, violent. He threatened my father, who refused to reveal where they were hiding. Her voice remained steady, but her knuckles whitened on the reins. When that failed, he began destroying the church, smashing pews, tearing down scripture hangings. Said he'd burn it down if necessary. What happened? Lucy heard the commotion. She confronted him, trying to protect my father and the church. They struggled. He fell, struck his head on the corner of a pew. Grace's eyes were distant with memory. It was an accident. Self-defense at worst. But in Lawrence, Wilson was a prominent businessman. His version would have been believed over a wife he'd abused for years. So you helped them run? She nodded. I got them on a train west that night. My father, her voice caught slightly. He didn't approve. Said I'd broken the law, brought scandal to his church. When the authorities came asking questions, he didn't defend me. Your own father. Calder couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. He believes in absolute obedience to authority. She explained, no bitterness in her tone, despite the story. To him, the law is the law, regardless of its justice. And you disagree. I believe in a higher justice, she said simply, one that doesn't ignore the cry of the oppressed. Her words hung in the air between them, resonating with something deep in Calder's own soul. He'd seen enough in the war to know that legal didn't always mean right, that sometimes a person had to stand against injustice regardless of the cost. I understand, he said finally. And I'm glad you helped them. She gave him a grateful look. Not everyone would say that. I'm not everyone. The words came out more intensely than he'd intended. I know what it's like to face impossible choices. Their eyes met, something unspoken passing between them. For a moment, Calder felt a connection he hadn't experienced since Martha, a recognition of shared values, of mutual understanding. The moment broke as they crested the final ridge before the ranch came into view. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Calder could make out Annie's small figure on the porch, watching for their return. We should focus on the immediate threat, he said, returning to practicalities. Grant won't wait for us to build a case against him. No, Grace agreed. But neither should we abandon hope of justice through proper channels. We pursue both paths, prepare for direct confrontation, while building our legal case. Agreed. He urged his horse forward. Let's get back. We have plans to make. As they approached the house, Annie ran to meet them, her small face alight with joy at their return. She reached up, and Calder swung down from his saddle to lift her into his arms. "Hello, little one," he murmured, holding her close. "Everything all right here?" She nodded against his shoulder, then pulled back to look at Grace, reaching out a small hand to her as well. Grace dismounted, taking Annie's outstretched hand in with a warm smile. "We missed you too," she said. The three of them walked toward the house together, Annie between them holding both their hands. The simple tableau struck Calder with unexpected force, a glimpse of what might be if they survived Grant's machinations. For that possibility alone, he would fight with everything he had. Inside, Hank awaited with news of his own riders, had been spotted along the western ridge watching the ranch house through field glasses. "Grant's men again?" Calder asked grimly. "Likely," Hank confirmed. "Keeping tabs on us." "Then we'll give them something to watch," Calder decided. "Starting tomorrow, I want the men armed at all times. Double the night watch. Make it obvious we're prepared." "Already done." Hank nodded. "And I sent word to my cousins, the ones who lost their place to Grant. They're willing to help if it comes to fighting." "Let's hope it doesn't," Grace interjected, though her expression was resolute. "But we'll be ready if it does." That evening, after Annie was asleep, the three adults gathered around the kitchen table, maps of the ranch spread before them. Calder outlined defensive positions, escape routes, contingencies for various scenarios. "If Grant moves against us directly," he explained, marking positions on the map, "we need to be prepared. The house is defensible, thick walls, clear lines of sight. The barn and bunkhouse less so. We should cache supplies," Hank suggested, "food, ammunition, medical necessities, in case we're cut off." "Good idea," Calder agreed. "And we need a safe place for Annie if things go badly." "The root cellar," Grace suggested. "It's well hidden, sturdy." They worked late into the night, planning for contingencies they hoped would never materialize. By the time they finished, a sense of grim determination had settled over them. "Get some rest," Calder told the others. "Tomorrow we start preparations in earnest." After Hank departed for the bunkhouse, Grace lingered, her expression troubled. "What is it?" Calder asked. "All this talk of defensive fighting," she hesitated. "I believe in standing against injustice, but I don't want to see more violence if it can be avoided." "Neither do I," he assured her. "This is precautionary. A show of strength might actually prevent a fight." She nodded, not entirely convinced. "And if it doesn't?" "Then we do what we must," he said simply, "to protect what's ours." "You sound like you've done this before." "In a way I have." He traced a scar on his hand absently. "The war taught me that sometimes you have to fight for what you believe in, for what you love." The word slipped out before he could catch it, hanging in the air between them. Grace's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't look away. "Yes," she said softly. "Sometimes you do." For a breathless moment, something shifted between them. Possibility, understanding, perhaps something more. Then Annie's small voice called from upstairs, breaking the spell. "She has nightmares sometimes," Calder explained, already moving toward the stairs. "Go." Grace nodded. "She needs you." As he climbed the stairs to comfort his daughter, Calder found himself caught between two worlds, the harsh reality of the coming conflict with Grant, and the unexpected warmth that had begun to grow in his home since Grace Evans's arrival. Both felt precarious, balanced on a knife's edge of circumstance and choice. both worth fighting for. Whatever came next, Calder Hayes would face it head-on, not just for the land his father had built or the legacy he hoped to leave Annie, but for the possibility of a future he hadn't dared imagine since Martha's death. A future that now, against all odds, included Grace Evans. The next week passed in a blur of preparation and watchful waiting. Calder and his men reinforced the perimeter of the ranch, stockpiled supplies, and established rotating guard shifts. To any observer, and Calder was certain Grant had observers, the Hayes Ranch was preparing for siege. Grace, meanwhile, maintained correspondence with their allies in town. Mrs. Smith sent coded messages hidden in packages of supplies, updating them on Judge Grant's movements and the growing network of sympathizers. Dr. Wilson provided medical supplies and information gleaned from treating the judge's associates. Through these channels, they learned that Grant had indeed accelerated his timeline. The railroad investors were pressing for certainty about the right-of-way through Hayes' land. Grant had assured them it would be secured by whatever means necessary. "What exactly does that mean?" Grace asked, as she and Calder reviewed Mrs. Smith's latest message in the kitchen one evening. "Nothing good," Calder replied grimly. "When Grant can't get what he wants legally, even by his twisted version of legal, he resorts to other methods." "Like the miller's fire." "Exactly." He rubbed his jaw stubble, rasping against his palm. "We need to be ready for anything." Annie sat nearby at the kitchen table, carefully shaping dough figures under Grace's occasional guidance. In the days since their trip to town, the girl had become Grace's shadow, following her through daily chores, watching her bake with rapt attention. Though still silent, Annie seemed more animated, her eyes brighter, her small gestures more frequent. "She's doing better," Grace observed, following Calder's gaze to his daughter. "The baking helps, I think. Gives her something to focus on besides." She trailed off, not wanting to name the dangers surrounding them. "Besides her father preparing for war," Calder finished quietly. Grace touched his arm briefly. "You're doing what you must to protect her. She understands that in her way." Before he could respond, Hank appeared at the door, his expression troubled. "Rider coming," the foreman announced. "Single from town." Calder was on his feet instantly. "Grant's man." "Don't think so. Looks like Sheriff Bishop." Surprise rippled through Calder. The sheriff had been cautiously supportive in town, but a personal visit to the ranch was unexpected and potentially dangerous for Bishop himself. "Get Annie upstairs," Calder instructed Grace, "just in case." She nodded, already moving to gather the child and her dough creations. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's continue upstairs while your father speaks with the visitor." Annie went willingly, though her solemn eyes lingered on Calder as she followed Grace up the stairs. The trust in that gaze strengthened his resolve. Whatever was coming, he would protect her. Calder met Sheriff Bishop in the yard, Hank standing vigilant nearby, rifle in hand. The sheriff dismounted, wearily, dust-coating his uniform, his expression grave beneath his mustache. "Hayes," he greeted with a nod, "need to speak with you. Privately." "My foreman stays," Calder countered. "He has my complete trust." Bishop hesitated, then nodded. "Fair enough. Is there somewhere we can talk, away from—" He gestured vaguely toward the distant ridge where they all knew Grant's watchers likely lurked. Calder led him to the barn, closing the heavy doors behind them. In the filtered light through the rafters, Bishop removed his hat, running a hand through sweat-dampened hair. "I shouldn't be here," he said without preamble. "If Grant knew—" "I appreciate the risk," Calder acknowledged. "What's happened?" Bishop took a deep breath. "Grant's made his move. Filed official foreclosure papers on your property this morning. Tax auction scheduled for next Monday." "That's only 5 days from now," Hank protested. The notice gave 30 days to pay, Grant's claiming special circumstances something about preventing economic harm to the county. Bishop's disgust was evident. It's all horseshit, of course, but legal on paper. He's rushing it through before we can build our case, Calder realized. Damn him. There's more. Bishop lowered his voice further. I overheard Jenkins and his boys at the saloon last night. They're planning something before the auction, something to ensure you can't contest it. What exactly? They didn't say outright, but Jenkins mentioned making sure you'd be otherwise occupied when the auction happens. The sheriff's expression hardened. I've seen enough of Grant's methods to know that means trouble. Serious trouble. Calder exchanged grim looks with Hank. When? Soon. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow. Bishop replaced his hat. I need to get back before I'm missed, but I had to warn you. I appreciate it, Sheriff, Calder said sincerely. This puts you at risk. Too many good people have lost everything to Grant's schemes, Bishop replied. I've looked the other way too long, telling myself I was protecting my family by not making waves. His jaw set. There comes a point where a man has to stand for something, risk be damned. Well said, Hank murmured. One more thing, Bishop added as they moved toward the barn doors. That register I mentioned, I got a look at it. Hayes Ranch is already listed as pending transfer to Colorado Eastern Holdings Grant's front company for the railroad interests. Before the auctions even happened, Calder noted bitterly. Pretty confident, isn't he? He's never lost, Bishop said simply. Be careful, Hayes, and if it comes to fighting... He hesitated, then continued. You didn't hear it from me, but the Millers, the Hendersons, and several others are ready to stand with you. Just say the word. With that surprising revelation, the sheriff mounted his horse and rode out, taking a circuitous route back toward town to avoid obvious connection to the Hayes Ranch. Calder watched him go, a mixture of gratitude and grim determination settling in his chest. The timeline had accelerated dramatically. Whatever defensive preparations they'd been making needed to be completed immediately. Inside the house, he found Grace in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled up as she vigorously kneaded dough. The rhythmic motion seemed to calm her, though her expression remained tense. Annie's upstairs with her books, she said as he entered. What did the sheriff want? Calder related Bishop's warnings, watching as Grace's hands stilled, then resumed their kneading with redoubled intensity. 5 days, she murmured. Not much time. No, he agreed. And if Jenkins and his men are planning something before then? We need to evacuate Annie, Grace said decisively. Tonight. She can't be here if there's going to be violence. Where would we send her? Everyone connected to us would be suspect. Grace considered, her hands never stopping their rhythmic work. What about Mrs. Smith? She has a sister in Boulder. Annie could stay there until this is resolved. It's risky, Calder frowned. The roads will be watched. More risky than keeping her here during an attack, Grace countered. He couldn't argue with that. The thought of Annie caught in the crossfire of whatever Grant was planning turned his blood cold. You're right, he conceded. But I don't want to send her with strangers. She needs someone she trusts. Grace met his eyes steadily. I'll take her. No, he said immediately. I need you here. The words hung between them, more revealing than he'd intended. Grace's hands stilled on the dough. Calder, she said gently. Annie trusts me. She'll be frightened enough without being handed to complete strangers. You'd both be at risk on the road, he argued, especially if Grant's men are watching. Then we'll need a diversion, she said simply. Something to draw their attention while we slip away. He started to protest again, then realized the logic of her plan. Annie would indeed be safer away from the ranch, and Grace was the only person besides himself the child seemed to trust completely. "All right," he said finally, "but not alone. Hank will accompany you." "Hank is your right hand," she countered. "You need him here." "I need my daughter safe more." His tone brooked no argument. "Hank goes with you, or nobody goes." Grace studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Very well. When? Tonight? After dark." He moved to the window, scanning the distant ridgeline. "We'll create that diversion you mentioned, make it look like we're moving men to the north boundary. Draw their eyes away from the south trail." As night fell, preparations moved with quiet efficiency. Annie was told only that she and Grace were taking a special trip to visit Mrs. Smith's sister, who had a daughter her age. The girl seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, clinging to her doll and watching the adults with solemn eyes. Calder knelt before her as Grace packed a small bag of necessities. "It's just for a little while, little one," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. "Until things settle here. Then I'll come for you." Annie stared at him, then reached out to touch his cheek where the old war scar ran. The gesture nearly undid him. "I'll keep her safe," Grace said softly from behind them. "You have my word." Calder stood turning to face her. In the lamplight, her green eyes were steady, determined. "I know you will." The sound of horses outside signaled Hank's readiness. The old foreman had prepared the buckboard with two of their steadiest horses, covering the back with canvas to shield its occupants from view and from bullets should it come to that. Calder helped Annie into the wagon, tucking a blanket around her against the night chill. Then he turned to Grace, words suddenly failing him. "Be careful," he managed finally. "You too," she replied, holding his gaze. "We'll return when it's safe." "If anything happens—" "It won't," she interrupted firmly. "Have faith, Calder Hayes." Without thinking, he took her hand, squeezing it briefly. "I do," he said simply. "In you." Something flickered in her eyes, surprise, perhaps, or something deeper. Before he could identify it, she squeezed his hand in return, then climbed into the wagon beside Annie. Hank mounted the driver's seat rifle across his lap. "We'll take the South Canyon route," he confirmed. "Should reach Boulder by morning if we push through." "Send word when you arrive," Calder instructed. "Be watchful." "Always am," the old man replied with a grim smile. "You watch yourself too, boss. Don't do anything foolish till we get back." With that, the wagon rolled quietly away from the house, keeping to the shadows, lanterns unlit. Calder watched until they disappeared into the darkness, a hollow feeling spreading in his chest. Then he turned to the task at hand, preparing the diversion that would hopefully draw Grant's watchers away from the escaping wagon. 4 of his remaining men mounted up, carrying extra horses to create the impression of a larger group. They rode openly toward the north boundary lanterns, swinging voices deliberately loud in the night air. With luck, any observers would follow, assuming the movement was preparation for defending against an imminent attack. Calder himself remained at the house, maintaining normal patterns lights in windows, smoke from the chimney. Nothing to suggest that the most vulnerable inhabitants had fled. Hours passed in tense waiting. Midnight came and went. Finally, near dawn, one of the men returned from the north boundary patrol. "No sign of followers, boss," he reported. "If they were watching, they didn't take the bait." Calder frowned. "Or they weren't interested in our movements at all." A cold suspicion formed in his mind. What if Jenkins and his men had already set their plan in motion? What if they weren't targeting the ranch at all, but— "Saddle my horse," he ordered abruptly. "Now!" 10 minutes later, he was riding hard toward the South Canyon route, fear driving him faster than caution warranted. If Grant's men had somehow learned of Annie and Grace's departure, he'd covered perhaps 5 miles when the sound of gunfire echoed faintly from ahead. His blood ran cold. Spurring his horse to greater speed, Calder crested a rise to see a sickening tableau in the valley below. The buckboard stood at an angle across the trail, one wheel broken. Hank crouched behind it, rifle firing at unseen assailants in the rocks above. Of Grace and Annie there was no sign. Calder drew his revolver and charged down the slope, firing toward the flashes from the rocks. His sudden appearance from behind seemed to confuse the attackers, their fire momentarily slackening. "Hank!" he shouted as he neared the wagon. "Where are they?" "Cave," the foreman called back between shots. 20 yards back. Got them there when the shooting started." Relief surged through Calder, followed immediately by renewed determination. He dismounted in a fluid motion, taking cover beside Hank behind the wagon's bed. "How many?" he asked, reloading his revolver. 4, maybe 5, Hank replied, his left arm bleeding from what appeared to be a grazing shot. "Jenkins for sure. Been at it about 10 minutes. They followed you from the ranch." "Ambushed us here," Hank corrected. "Must have known the route somehow. They were waiting." The implications were troubling, but Calder had no time to consider them. "Cover me," he instructed. "I'm going to circle around behind them." "Too risky," Hank protested. "They've got the high ground." "And we've got people to protect," Calder countered. "Just keep their attention for 5 minutes." Without waiting for further argument, he slipped away from the wagon using the pre-dawn darkness and scattered boulders for cover. Years of military experience guided him as he circled wide, approaching the attacker's position from above rather than below. From his new vantage point, he could make out 4 figures spread among the rocks. Jenkins, indeed, among them, directing the others with hand signals. They were so focused on the wagon below that they hadn't noticed Calder's approach. He took careful aim at the nearest man and fired. The shot echoed in the canyon, followed by a cry of pain, as the man clutched his shoulder and fell. Before the others could react, Calder fired twice more, forcing them to scramble for better cover. "Jenkins," he called out, voice carrying in the dawn stillness. "It's over. Throw down your weapons." "Hayes." Jenkins sounded genuinely surprised. "How the hell?" "Doesn't matter." Calder cut him off. "I've got the high ground now. Your man's wounded. Surrender, and you all walk away alive." A pause, then Jenkins's mocking laugh. "Big talk from a man about to lose everything. Grant's already got the papers drawn up. This time tomorrow Hayes Ranch won't exist anymore." "Then he can come take it himself," Calder replied evenly, like a man not sending dogs to do his dirty work. The insult hit its mark. Jenkins cursed, then suddenly rose from cover pistol aimed not at Calder, but toward the wagon below. "How about this, Hayes?" he called. "You show yourself nice and clear, or I put a bullet in your foreman's head right now." Calder hesitated. From his position he could likely hit Jenkins before the man could fire accurately at Hank. But if he missed? The decision was made for him when a shot rang out not from Jenkins or Calder, but from farther up the canyon. Jenkins cried out, his gun hand, suddenly bloody weapon falling to the rocks. More shots followed in rapid succession, driving Jenkins's remaining men into desperate retreat. Calder held his position, confused by this unexpected development. Then a familiar voice called from across the canyon, "Hayes, you alive up there?" Calder peered through the growing dawn light to see Sheriff Bishop, along with several armed men he recognized as former victims of Grant's schemes, Jacob Henderson among them. "Bishop," he called back, astonished. "What are you doing here?" "Saving your hide, apparently," the sheriff replied, moving down to secure the wounded Jenkins. "Though you seem to be holding your own." As the unexpected reinforcements rounded up Jenkins and his men, Calder hurried back to the wagon, heart pounding. "Hank, where are Grace and Annie?" "Cave entrance just beyond those junipers," the foreman directed, binding his wounded arm. "They're fine, boss. Miss Evans made sure of that." Calder found the small cave entrance partially hidden by brush. "Grace," he called softly. "Annie, it's me. It's safe now." For a moment, nothing. Then Grace emerged, rifle in hand, one of Hank's backups. Calder realized her expression fierce and protective. Behind her, Annie clutched her skirts, eyes wide but remarkably calm. Grace's posture relaxed slightly at the sight of him. "Is it really over?" "It's over." He confirmed an overwhelming urge to gather them both in his arms, nearly overcoming him. He settled for kneeling before Annie. "You all right, little one?" To his amazement, Annie nodded, then spoke, her voice small and rusty from disuse, but unmistakable. "Grace kept me safe." The world seemed to stop. Calder stared at his daughter, scarcely believing what he'd heard. "Annie," he whispered, You spoke." Grace's hand went to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. "Oh, Annie." The little girl looked between them, then continued haltingly. "The bad men tried to hurt us. Grace said, 'Be brave, like Pa.'" Calder couldn't contain himself any longer. He pulled Annie into his arms, holding her as if she might disappear. "That's right," he managed through the tightness in his throat. "Brave like your ma, too." Over Annie's head, his eyes met Grace's, sharing a moment of pure joy amidst the chaos. Without thinking, he reached out his free arm, pulling Grace into the embrace as well. For a precious moment, they stood together, a family forged in crisis. Then reality intruded, as Sheriff Bishop approached, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Hate to interrupt," the sheriff said, "but we need to move. Jenkins is secure, but there could be more of Grant's men around." Calder reluctantly released Grace and Annie, though he kept a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder. "How did you know to come here?" he asked Bishop. The sheriff glanced at Grace. "Mrs. Smith sent word. Said Miss Evans had figured out there might be an informant among your hands, someone feeding information to Grant. When she and Hank planned this evacuation, they only told a select few the actual route." Calder turned to Grace, surprised. "You suspected a traitor." She nodded. It was the only explanation for how Grant always seemed one step ahead. "I discussed it with Hank, and we agreed to be cautious." "Smart thinking," Calder acknowledged, newfound respect in his gaze. "Both of you." "Not smart enough," Hank called from where Henderson was rebinding his wound. "They still found us." "Which narrows down who the informant could be," Grace pointed out. "Only 3 men knew this route." Bishop nodded grimly. "And when we get back to the ranch, we'll find out which one." As they prepared to return the buckboard damaged beyond immediate repair, necessitating riding double, Calder found a moment alone with Grace. "You saved my daughter," he said simply. "Twice now. Once with your kindness bringing her voice back, and now with your courage." Grace shook her head. "Annie saved herself. She's stronger than anyone knows, like her father." The admiration in her eyes stirred something in Calder's chest that he'd thought long buried. "Grace, Boss." Hank's urgent call interrupted whatever he might have said. Rider coming fast from the ranch. All eyes turned to the approaching horseman, Timothy, the youngest of Calder's hands, riding as if demons pursued him. "Mr. Hayes," the boy shouted as he neared. "The ranch, it's on fire." The scene that greeted them as they crested the final ridge overlooking Hayes Ranch struck Calder like a physical blow. Smoke billowed from the barn and bunkhouse flames clearly visible even in the morning light. Men scrambled with buckets, fighting a losing battle against the blaze. "No," he breathed, urging his horse faster down the slope, Grace and Annie clinging behind him. Sheriff Bishop kept pace beside him. "Grant's backup plan," the lawman growled. "If the ambush failed, burn you out." They reached the yard to find organized chaos. The barn was nearly consumed, the bunkhouse partially so. By some miracle, or the efforts of the hands, the main house still stood, though smoke stained one corner where the fire had been beaten back. Calder leapt from his horse, lifting Annie down and passing her to Grace. "Get her inside," he ordered. "Stay there." For once, Grace didn't argue, hurrying Annie toward the relative safety of the house. Calder turned to the nearest ranch hand. "What happened?" "Fire started in the barn," the man panted, face blackened with smoke, almost simultaneously in the bunkhouse. "Had to be set." "Anyone see who did it?" Peterson thought he saw someone riding away, but he was too busy trying to save the horses. "The horses?" Calder's heart clenched. "Did they get out?" "Most of 'em. Lost 2 in the stalls furthest back." Cursing, Calder joined the bucket line, working alongside his men to contain the blaze. For nearly an hour, they fought the fire, eventually subduing it before it could spread to the main house or the remaining outbuildings. As the immediate danger passed, exhaustion set in. Calder stood amidst the smoldering ruins of his barn, the structure his father had built with his own hands, and felt a cold rage building within him. Sheriff Bishop approached his uniform stained with smoke and ash. "This was deliberate," he stated flatly. "No question." "None," Calder agreed. "Grant's making his move." "The timing's no coincidence," Bishop added. "With the auction scheduled for Monday, he's ensuring you're too busy rebuilding to mount any opposition." Calder's jaw tightened. "He's wrong." Before Bishop could respond, a commotion arose near the house. One of Calder's hands, Davis, a quiet man who'd joined the ranch only 3 months prior, was being forcibly restrained by Henderson and another man. "We found him trying to ride out," Henderson explained as they approached. "Had this in his saddlebag." He held up a small leather pouch. Bishop took it, opening the drawstring to reveal several gold coins. "Payment," the sheriff surmised. "For services rendered to Grant, I'd wager." Davis struggled against his captors. "You can't prove anything." "Can't I?" Bishop countered. "Gold eagles with last year's mint, same as Grant pays his tax collectors." He stepped closer to the man. "How long have you been his spy, Davis?" The man's defiance crumbled slightly. "I ain't saying nothing without a lawyer." "Your choice," Bishop shrugged. "Though I doubt Grant will waste money defending you now that you've been caught. More likely, he'll let you hang to protect himself." Fear flickered in Davis's eyes. "I want protection," he demanded. "If I talk." "Depends what you say," Bishop replied evenly. What followed was a damning confession. Davis had indeed been planted by Grant months earlier when the judge first set his sights on Hayes Ranch. He'd reported on defenses, routines, conversations, and most recently the planned evacuation route for Annie and Grace. "And the fire?" Calder asked, barely containing his rage. Davis shook his head. "Wasn't me. That was Jenkins's idea as backup. Must have had someone else do it when he didn't return." "Who else works for Grant here?" Bishop pressed. "No one I know of," Davis insisted. "Grant keeps his agents separate. Safer that way." Calder turned away in disgust. The man had eaten at his table, worked alongside loyal hands, all while plotting destruction. The betrayal stung almost as much as the damage itself. "Lock him in the root cellar," he instructed Henderson. "Sheriff can take him when he leaves." As Davis was led away, Bishop touched Calder's arm. This testimony could be valuable haze, evidence of Grant's methods. Fat lot of good it does me now, Calder replied bitterly, gesturing to the smoldering ruins. Barn's gone, half my winter feed with it. 2 good horses dead. But your house stands, Bishop pointed out. And your family's safe. The words penetrated Calder's anger. His house, his family. Annie and Grace both unharmed, despite Grant's best efforts. You're right, he acknowledged, straightening his shoulders. We're still standing. And you're not alone, Bishop added, nodding toward the yard where Henderson the Millers and several other local ranchers were already organizing cleanup efforts. Word's spreading about Grant's tactics. People are choosing sides. Choosing danger, you mean, Calder corrected. Grant won't take this defiance lightly. No, Bishop agreed. He won't, which is why we need to move faster than he expects. What do you have in mind? The sheriff's expression turned calculating. Grant thinks he's won that between the ambush and the fire. You'll be too devastated to oppose Monday's auction. He's counting on your absence. So we show up, Calder surmised, beginning to follow the sheriff's thinking. Not just show up. Bishop's eyes gleamed. We bring evidence, witnesses, make it public. Grant rules through fear and secrecy. Let's drag his methods into the light. It was a bold plan, perhaps too bold. He controls the courthouse, Calder reminded him. The moment we present evidence against him, he'll dismiss it. Not if enough people witness it, Bishop countered. Not if we have Davis's testimony, the register showing the prearranged sale proof of Grant's railroad interests. A public confrontation, Calder mused. It's risky. Less risky than waiting for him to send more men with torches, the sheriff argued. Or worse. Before Calder could respond, Grace appeared at the house door waving urgently. Both men hurried to her. Annie's asking for you, she told Calder. She's upset about the horses. Calder nodded, the personal temporarily outweighing the strategic. We'll continue this discussion later, he told Bishop. Inside, he found Annie sitting at the kitchen table, tears streaming down her face. Thunder, she asked as he entered, her newly recovered voice trembling. Is Thunder okay? Thunder's fine, he assured her, kneeling beside her chair. He was in the corral, not the barn. He's safe. Relief washed over her small face. The bad men did it, she stated with surprising clarity. The ones who tried to hurt Grace. Yes, Calder confirmed, seeing no reason to shield her from a truth she'd already deduced. But they've been caught now. They can't hurt us anymore. Annie's expression turned thoughtful. Will they burn more things? The innocent question cut to the heart of their predicament. Calder glanced at Grace, who had remained near the door, then back to his daughter. Not if I can help it, he promised. That's why I need to go to town soon, to make sure the bad men are stopped for good. Annie considered this, then nodded with surprising maturity. Grace will stay with me. If that's what you want, Calder replied, aware he was asking Grace's agreement without consulting her. Of course I'll stay, Grace confirmed, moving to place a reassuring hand on Annie's shoulder. We'll be right here, waiting for your father to return. Annie seemed satisfied with this arrangement. Her tears dried as she leaned against Grace's side, a picture of trust that squeezed Calder's heart. Why don't you go upstairs and change into clean clothes? Grace suggested gently. I'll be up in a moment to help. When Annie had gone, Grace turned to Calder, her expression grave. How bad is it? Barn's a total loss. Bunkhouse can be salvaged. House is intact, thank God. He ran a hand through his ash-streaked hair. Could have been worse. And the men responsible? Davis was Grant's spy. He's locked in the root cellar. Jenkins and his gang are in Bishop's custody. Calder's expression hardened. But the real culprit is still sitting in his courthouse untouched. Grace's eyes flashed with anger. Not for long, I hope. Bishop wants to confront him publicly at the auction on Monday. Bring evidence, witnesses, force everything into the open. It's a good plan, she said thoughtfully. Grant thrives in shadows. In public, with enough witnesses, he'd be forced to at least maintain the appearance of legality. It's dangerous, Calder countered, for everyone involved. So is doing nothing, she replied simply. Sometimes the greater risk lies in inaction. The echo of their earlier conversation about justice wasn't lost on him. You still believe that, after everything that's happened? I believe it more, she said firmly. What happened today proves Grant's desperation. He knows a legitimate challenge could succeed, so he's resorting to violence. Calder studied her, this remarkable woman who had brought his daughter's voice back, who had faced gunfire without flinching, who still believed in justice despite everything. If we do this, he said slowly, there's no going back. Win or lose, Grant will never forget who stood against him. Some stands must be taken, she replied, regardless of the consequence. Their eyes held a silent understanding passing between them. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Outside, the sounds of men clearing debris and salvaging what they could from the barn drifted through the windows. Friends, neighbors, people choosing to stand with the Hayes Ranch despite the risk. Perhaps Calder thought Bishop was right. Perhaps Grant's power was already beginning to crumble. Get some rest, he told Grace. We have plans to make. She nodded, turning toward the stairs, then paused. Calder, when Annie spoke in the cave, do you know what she said before you arrived? What? A soft smile touched Grace's lips. She said, Grace, are you my new mama? I didn't know how to answer her. The simple statement hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. And now, Calder asked, his voice rough, how would you answer now? Grace's eyes shone with emotion. I would say that nothing would honor me more, if her father agreed. Before Calder could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Shouts, horses' hooves, the sound of many men arriving. They moved to the window together to see a sight that chilled Calder's blood. At least a dozen riders had entered the yard, led by none other than Judge Edward Grant himself. He's here, Grace whispered instinctively, stepping closer to Calder. Why would he come himself? To gloat, Calder replied grimly. Or worse. Sheriff Bishop appeared on the porch, hand on his sidearm, confronting the new arrivals. Words were exchanged that they couldn't hear. Stay with Annie, Calder instructed, already moving toward the door. Lock yourselves in her room if necessary. Be careful, Grace called after him. As Calder stepped onto his porch, Judge Grant's cold gaze fixed on him with calculating intensity. The judge sat his horse with the straight-backed dignity of a man accustomed to command, flanked by armed men, including a subdued Willie Grant. Mr. Hayes, the judge called, voice carrying across the yard, I've come to make you a final offer. Calder moved to stand beside Sheriff Bishop on the porch, acutely aware of the armed men surrounding Judge Grant. His own rifle leaned against the doorframe within reach, but not in hand, a deliberate choice to avoid immediate escalation. Judge Grant, he acknowledged coldly, you've got nerve showing your face here after what your men did. Grant's expression remained imperious, unbothered by the accusation. I'm not responsible for the actions of desperate men, Mr. Hayes, though I understand your property has suffered some unfortunate damage. A terrible coincidence. There are no coincidences where you're concerned, Grant, Calder replied. Only schemes and blood money. The judge's mouth tightened slightly, the only indication that the barb had landed. Your situation grows more precarious by the hour, Hayes. Your barn is ashes. Your men are scattered. And I hold legal documents authorizing seizure of this property in 3 days' time. Legal documents based on fraudulent claims, Sheriff Bishop interjected, earning a sharp glance from Grant. Be careful, Sheriff, the judge warned. Your badge is granted by county authority, my authority. Bishop stood his ground. My badge represents the law, Judge. The real law, not your twisted version of it. A murmur ran through the assembled men, not just Grant's supporters, Calder realized, but also the ranchers and townspeople who had come to help with the fire. Witnesses to this confrontation. Grant seemed to realize this too, his approach shifting subtly. I've come in good faith, Mr. Hayes, he announced, voice pitched to carry. Despite your accusations, I'm prepared to offer you one final opportunity to resolve this matter with dignity. I'm listening, Calder said, crossing his arms. $1,000, Grant declared. Cash, enough to settle elsewhere with your daughter. A generous sum considering the circumstances. The offer hung in the air, unexpectedly substantial. $1,000 was indeed enough to start fresh somewhere else, perhaps in Oregon or California, far from Grant's reach. For a brief moment, Calder allowed himself to consider it. An end to the fighting. Safety for Annie. Perhaps even a new beginning with Grace at his side. Then his gaze traveled over the land his father had built, the streams, the pastures, the distant mountains that had called to generations of Hayes men. This wasn't just property, it was legacy, identity, home. No, he said simply. Grant's eyebrows rose slightly. No, perhaps you misunderstood. $1,000, Hayes. Take it and leave with your dignity and your life intact. I understood perfectly, Calder replied, voice steady. And my answer is no. This land isn't for sale, not for 1,000, not for 10,000. The judge's facade of magnanimity cracked, revealing the cold calculation beneath. You're a fool, Hayes. Your position is untenable. The auction proceeds on Monday, regardless of your wishes. Then I'll see you at the auction, Calder challenged. Along with evidence of your corruption, your connection to the railroad investors, and testimony from your own men about the methods you've employed. That struck home. Grant's face darkened, his gaze flickering briefly to Sheriff Bishop, then to the gathered witnesses. Dangerous accusations, he said, voice lowered. The kind that could have serious consequences for a man in your precarious position. Is that another threat, Judge? Bishop asked loudly, ensuring all could hear. Grant ignored him, focusing on Calder. I'm offering you a clean exit, Hayes. One last chance to walk away unscathed. Once refused, it won't come again. I've faced worse threats than yours, Grant, Calder replied evenly. Men with more courage and better cause. You don't frighten me. The judge's eyes narrowed. Perhaps not. But what about your daughter, your housekeeper? His gaze shifted momentarily to the house behind Calder. Are you willing to risk their safety for pride? The implied threat to Annie and Grace sent cold rage through Calder's veins. He stepped forward, hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm, only to be stopped by Bishop's restraining grip on his arm. Careful, the sheriff murmured. That's what he wants. With visible effort, Calder controlled himself. You come to my home, he said, voice dangerously quiet. Stand on my land and threaten my family. You're either very brave or very stupid, Edward Grant. A tense silence fell over the yard. Grant's men shifted nervously, hands near weapons. The ranchers and townspeople who had come to help Calder did the same. It was Willie Grant who broke the impasse surprisingly. "Father," he said, urging his horse forward, "we've made our offer. Hayes has refused. Let the law take its course on Monday." The unexpected reasonableness from the younger Grant surprised Calder. Willie met his gaze briefly, something unreadable in his expression. After a moment's consideration, Judge Grant nodded curtly. "Very well. The auction stands. Monday at noon." He gathered his reins. "I suggest you use the intervening time wisely, Hayes. Pack your belongings. Say your goodbyes." With that, he wheeled his horse around, his men following. As they reached the edge of the yard, he turned back. "One more thing, Hayes. Miss Evans," his voice carried clearly. "I've received correspondence from Kansas regarding a certain matter. It seems the authorities there are most interested in speaking with her about the death of Thomas Wilson. I've invited them to attend Monday's proceedings." Calder's blood ran cold. He heard the front door open behind him, knew without looking that Grace had heard every word. "That's your idea of justice, Grant," he called after the retreating judge, "persecuting an innocent woman to get what you want." Grant merely smiled thinly. "Justice takes many forms, Mr. Hayes. I suggest you both be prepared to face it." With that parting shot, the judge and his entourage rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and tension in their wake. Calder turned to find Grace standing in the doorway, her face pale but composed. "He's bluffing," she said, though uncertainty tinged her voice. "The Kansas authorities closed the case months ago. Lucy's husband was ruled an accidental death." "Grant doesn't bluff," Bishop said grimly. "If he says he's contacted Kansas, he has. But without new evidence, he doesn't need evidence," Calder interrupted. "Just the accusation. Enough to have you detained, questioned. Enough to remove you from the picture during the crucial moment." Understanding dawned in Grace's eyes. "He's isolating you," she realized, "removing your supports one by one. First Annie, now me." "And it won't stop there," Bishop added. "He'll find ways to neutralize the rest of us before Monday." Calder's jaw tightened as the full scope of Grant's strategy became clear. The judge was methodically eliminating every potential obstacle, every ally who might stand with Calder against the auction. "We need to accelerate our plans," he decided. "Bishop, can you get Davis's testimony formally recorded today, sworn and signed?" The sheriff nodded. "I'll take him to my office now. Have it all documented before Grant can interfere." "Good. And the property register you mentioned, can we get a copy?" "Already done." Bishop patted his breast pocket. "Made a copy this morning before leaving town. Not official, but it shows the pattern clearly enough." "Mrs. Smith has been gathering statements from others Grant has forced out," Grace added, "and Dr. Wilson has records of accidents that coincided with property transfers." "We'll need all of it," Calder said. "And more importantly, we'll need protection for everyone involved. Grant won't hesitate to use force to silence witnesses." Bishop considered. "I can deputize men I trust. Give them legal authority to provide security." "Do it," Calder instructed, "and spread the word. Anyone who stands with us should travel in groups. Stay vigilant." As the sheriff departed, with the reluctant Davis in custody, Calder turned to Grace, who had maintained her composure despite Grant's threat. "You should go," he said quietly when they were alone on the porch. "Take Annie and keep riding. Boulder, Denver, beyond. Somewhere Grant's reach doesn't extend." "No," she replied simply. "Grace, he's serious about contacting Kansas. Even if there's no real case against you, he can make things difficult, dangerous. I'm well aware of what Edward Grant is capable of." she said, her voice steady. "Which is precisely why I won't run. Not again." "This isn't your fight," Calder argued, though, even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. Somehow, in the weeks since her arrival, Grace Evans had become intrinsically connected to the fate of Hayes Ranch and to its owner. "It became my fight the moment I stepped onto this land," she countered. "The moment Annie trusted me. The moment you did." Her green eyes held his unwavering. "I won't abandon you now, Calder. Not when you need every ally you can get." He wanted to argue further, to insist on her safety and Annie's, but the determination in her gaze stopped him. Grace Evans had made her choice, the same choice he would have made in her position. "All right," he conceded. "But Annie should still go." Mrs. Smith's sister in Boulder agreed. Grace nodded. "She shouldn't be here for what's coming. I'll arrange it with Hank." With that decided, they turned to the immediate task of securing the ranch. The barn was beyond saving, but the bunkhouse could be partially repaired. More pressing was the need to prepare defenses in case Grant decided to abandon legal pretenses entirely. Throughout the afternoon, neighboring ranchers arrived with supplies, offers of help, and in several cases, armed support. Jacob Henderson brought 4 of his best men. The Miller cousins came with wagons of lumber and feed for the surviving livestock. Even Samuel Wright, who had lost his store to Grant's machinations, arrived with provisions and a Springfield rifle he'd kept hidden since the war. "Never thought I'd see the day," Hank remarked, as he and Calder surveyed the growing encampment from the porch that evening. "Half the county standing against Grant." "Not half enough," Calder replied soberly, "and Grant still holds the legal high ground." "Legal don't mean much when folks decide they've had enough," the old foreman observed. "I've seen it before. One man stands up, gives others courage to do the same." "Let's hope it's enough," Calder said, watching as Grace moved among the volunteers distributing coffee and food with quiet efficiency. "We've got 3 days to build a case strong enough to withstand Grant's influence." Hank followed his gaze to Grace, a knowing look crossing his weathered features. "She's something special, that one. Reminds me of Martha in some ways, different in others." "Yes?" Calder agreed, simply unwilling to articulate the complex emotions Grace Evans had awakened in him. Guilt still tangled with growing affection, loyalty to Martha's memory with the undeniable pull toward a future he'd thought forever closed to him. "Martha would approve, you know," Hank said quietly. "She wasn't one to wish loneliness on anyone, least of all you and Annie." Before Calder could respond, a commotion at the edge of the property caught their attention. A rider approached at speed, silhouetted against the setting sun. "One of ours?" Calder asked, hand moving to his holster. "Don't recognize the horse," Hank replied, reaching for his rifle. As the rider drew closer, however, Calder relaxed slightly. "It's Willie Grant," he identified, surprised. "Alone." Indeed, the judge's son reined in his lathered horse at the edge of the yard, hands raised to show he carried no weapons. His usual arrogance was notably absent, his expression grim. "Hayes," he called. "I need to speak with you. Alone." Suspicion rippled through Calder. "Why should I trust you, Grant?" "Because I'm here against my father's orders," Willie replied, surprising frankness in his tone. "And because what I have to tell you might be the only chance you have of saving your ranch and Miss Evans." Despite his misgivings, Calder's curiosity was piqued. He descended the porch steps, signaling the armed men nearby to stand ready but not interfere. "Say your piece," he instructed when he reached Willie, maintaining a cautious distance. The younger man dismounted, his movements betraying exhaustion. "My father is planning to move against you tonight," he said without preamble. "Not just legal maneuvers, armed men. 12 at least." Why tell me this? Calder asked, skeptical. You've never shown concern for my welfare before. Willie's expression twisted with something like shame. I've done many things I'm not proud of, Hayes, following my father's orders without question, harassing Miss Evans in town. He shook his head. But there are lines even I won't cross. Murder is one of them. Murder, Calder's blood ran cold. That's what it would be, Willie confirmed. The plan is to provoke a confrontation claim self-defense when shooting starts. With you gone, the auction proceeds unopposed. His gaze lifted to the house, and Miss Evans is taken into custody for the Kansas matter. And Annie, Calder demanded, what happens to my daughter in this plan? A flicker of genuine remorse crossed Willie's face. I don't know. I didn't ask. He straightened. That's why I'm here. Whatever grievance exists between us, Hayes, a child, shouldn't suffer for it. Calder studied the younger man, weighing his sincerity against years of antagonism. Why now, Willie? What changed? Willie glanced away momentarily, unable to meet Calder's gaze. I saw what happened at the Miller place. Watched men I've known my whole life burn a family out of their home on my father's orders. His voice lowered. I told myself it was progress. Necessary. The price of building a greater Colorado. A bitter laugh escaped him. I was a damn fool. The raw honesty in the admission was unexpected. Calder found himself reassessing the man before him, not the strutting bully who had harassed Grace in town, but a son struggling to escape his father's shadow. How many men? He asked, practical concerns taking precedence. When exactly? After midnight, Willie supplied. A dozen, maybe more. Jenkins's remaining men, plus some hired guns from Denver. Armed how? Rifles, pistols. Nothing military grade, but enough to overwhelm your defenses if they catch you unprepared. Calder nodded grimly. And your father will he be with them? No, Willie shook his head. He never dirties his hands directly. He'll maintain his distance, his plausible deniability. It fit with what Calder knew of Edward Grant, a man who orchestrated destruction while keeping himself above reproach. Why should I believe you? He asked, though he was already inclined to. Willie's demeanor lacked the smug superiority that had always characterized him. This could be a trap. Draw us out, divide our forces. It's not, Willie insisted. I know you have no reason to trust me, Hayes, but I'm trying to prevent a massacre. My father has gone too far. He reached into his coat slowly to avoid alarming Calder and withdrew a folded paper. This is a copy of the order he sent to Kansas, requesting authorities there to apprehend Miss Evans. It's genuine. Calder took the document, scanning it quickly. It indeed appeared authentic, complete with Judge Grant's official seal. I need to warn my men, he said, decision made. How much time do we have? 4 hours, maybe 5, Willie estimated. They're gathering at the old Carson place north of town. You should go, Calder advised. If your father discovers you've warned us, I know the risk, Willie cut him off. But I've made my choice. The echo of Grace's earlier words wasn't lost on Calder. What will you do now? A flicker of uncertainty crossed Willie's face. I don't know. I can't go back, not after this. Maybe head west. California, perhaps. Calder studied him a moment longer, then made a decision that surprised even himself. There's a place for you here if you want it, at least until this is over. Willie's shock was evident. You'd trust me to stay after everything. Trust is earned, Calder replied evenly, but everyone deserves a chance to make things right. He extended his hand. Your choice, Willie. After a moment's hesitation, Willie Grant took the offered hand, his grip firm. "Thank you," he said simply. Together they walked back toward the house where Grace stood watching from the porch, her expression a mixture of surprise and wariness at the unexpected alliance. The next hours passed in a flurry of preparation. Calder gathered his allies, now numbering nearly 20 armed men, and outlined the coming threat. Willie provided details of likely approach routes, tactics his father's men might employ, and weaknesses they could exploit. "We don't shoot first," Calder instructed firmly. "We defend only. If they come armed onto Hayes land, we have the right to protect ourselves, but I want no one claiming we provoked this." The men nodded in understanding. Most were ranchers like himself, not gunfighters or soldiers, but men defending their way of life against a common threat. Grace took charge of preparing the house itself, securing windows, moving furniture to create barricades, if needed, gathering medical supplies. Annie was kept upstairs, ostensibly preparing for her journey to Boulder the following day, though Calder suspected the girl understood more than they credited. As darkness fell, Calder found a moment alone with Grace in the kitchen, where she was preparing bandages and poultices under Dr. Wilson's direction. "You should rest," he urged, noting the exhaustion lining her face. "It's been a long day." "So should you," she countered, not pausing in her work. "But neither of us will." He smiled faintly at that. "Stubborn woman." "Determined," she corrected the ghost of a smile, touching her lips. "There's a difference." Calder leaned against the doorframe, watching her efficient movements. "Do you believe him, Willie?" She considered the question seriously. "Yes," she said finally. His remorse seemed genuine, and the document he brought matches others I've seen from the judge's office. "I thought so too," Calder admitted, "though it feels strange trusting a Grant after everything." "People can surprise you," Grace observed. "Sometimes even themselves." Their eyes met across the kitchen, mutual understanding passing between them. In the weeks since Grace's arrival, they had both been surprised by each other, by themselves, by the unexpected bond that had formed between them. "Grace," Calder began, suddenly needing to speak what had been growing in his heart. "If we survive tonight, if we somehow win against Grant on Monday—" She stilled her hands, waiting. "Annie asked if you were her new mother," he continued, voice roughening. "I've been wondering the same thing." A flush colored Grace's cheeks, but her gaze remained steady. "Are you asking me something, Calder Hayes?" "Not yet," he admitted. "Not properly, not with Grant's men bearing down on us, and the future uncertain. But when this is over—" He stepped closer, taking her hand in his. "When we're free of Grant's shadow, I want to ask you properly, if you'd be willing to hear the question." Grace's free hand rose to his cheek, her touch gentle against his scarred skin. "I would be honored to hear it," she whispered, "and to answer." For a suspended moment, they stood together in the warm kitchen light, the chaos of preparation fading into the background. Then, reluctantly, Calder stepped back, duty reasserting itself. "I should check the defenses," he said. "Make sure everyone's in position." Grace nodded understanding in her eyes. "Be careful, Calder." "Always am," he replied with a faint smile echoing their earlier exchange. Outside, the ranch had transformed into a carefully organized, defensive position. Men were stationed at strategic points around the property, using the natural features of the land for cover. The ruined barn provided an unfortunate but effective vantage point, its charred beams offering concealment for two of Henderson's best marksmen. Hank had positioned the remaining horses in the corral furthest from likely approach routes, with a man assigned specifically to protect them in case of another fire attempt. Water barrels had been positioned near all structures, buckets at the ready. "How are we looking?" Calder asked as he joined the old foreman near the bunkhouse. "As ready as we'll ever be," Hank replied. "If Willie's information is accurate, we should see them coming from the North Ridge." He gestured toward the distant rise, barely visible in the moonlight. "Henderson's boy is stationed up on the east bluff with a spyglass. He'll signal if he spots movement." Calder nodded, scanning the darkened landscape. "And Bishop sent word he's gathered 6 deputies he trusts. They're positioned along the road from town, ready to intercept if Grant tries to bring reinforcements." It was as thorough a defense as they could muster on short notice. Calder only hoped it would be enough. "What about Willie?" he asked, noting the judge's son was not among the visible defenders. Inside, Hank jerked his head toward the house. "Said he would be more useful identifying his father's men if they breached the perimeter. Though I suspect he's also avoiding showing his face too early. Element of surprise and all that." Calder couldn't blame him for the caution. Willie's presence among the defenders would be a powerful card to play, but only at the right moment. As midnight approached, a tense quiet settled over the ranch. Men checked weapons one final time, adjusted positions for better cover, exchanged grim nods of solidarity. In the house, lamps were extinguished, save one in the kitchen, creating the impression of a household mostly asleep. Calder made a final circuit of their defenses, then took his position on the porch rifle across his knees, Winchester leaning within reach. From here, he could oversee the yard, direct his men if needed, and most importantly, protect the house and those within it if Grant's forces broke through. Grace joined him briefly, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the night chill. "Annie's finally asleep," she reported quietly. "Though it took some convincing." "She knows something's wrong," Calder guessed. "She's perceptive." Grace settled beside him on the porch step. "And she loves her father very much." Calder's throat tightened unexpectedly. "I've tried to protect her from all this." "You have," Grace assured him. "But children sense more than we realize. She knows you're fighting for her home, for her future." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the night sounds of the ranch crickets, distant cattle, the occasional snort of a horse wrapping around them. "I've been thinking," Grace said finally, "about what happens after, if we succeed." "Oh," she nodded, her profile silver in the moonlight. "I want to start a school, here on the ranch, for children like Annie, those who've experienced trauma who need special attention." The simple declaration caught Calder by surprise, not in its content, but in its assumption of a shared future. "A school," he repeated, testing the idea. "On Hayes land." "If that would be acceptable," she added, suddenly less certain. "I have some savings from before Kansas. It would be enough to begin at least." Calder found himself smiling despite the gravity of their situation. "I think it's a fine idea," he said honestly. "This land should be about more than cattle and crops. It should be about building something lasting, something good." Relief and pleasure brightened her expression. "I was hoping you'd say that." "Did you doubt it?" "Not doubt exactly," she clarified. "But a school would change things, bring strangers to your land, children, parents. Life," he said simply. "It would bring life after too much death." His hand found hers in the darkness. "I can think of nothing better for this place. For Annie, for us." The word us lingered between them, full of promise, despite the uncertain hours ahead. Grace's fingers tightened around his, warm and solid and real. The moment was shattered by a sharp whistle from the eastern bluff. Henderson's boy, the lookout. One long, two short, the signal for approaching riders. Calder was on his feet instantly, Grace rising beside him. "Go inside," he urged. "Stay with Annie." She nodded, but before turning away, she stretched up to press a swift, fierce kiss to his lips. "Come back to us," she whispered against his mouth. Then she was gone, slipping into the house as Calder raised his arm to signal the defenders. Men shifted in the darkness, taking final positions, weapons at the ready. From the north ridge came the first sign of their visitors, a line of riders silhouetted briefly against the night sky before descending into the shadow of the valley. Calder counted at least 10, possibly more. "Remember," he called softly to his men, voice carrying in the still air, "no first shots. Defend only." A chorus of affirmative murmurs answered him. These were not hired guns or vigilantes. They were homesteaders, ranchers, shopkeepers, men with families and futures who had chosen to stand against tyranny, not for glory or profit, but because it was right. As Grant's men approached the edge of the Hayes property, Calder stepped forward into the yard rifle held non-threateningly at his side but visible. "That's far enough," he called, voice steady and clear. "This is private property. State your business." The riders halted momentarily, surprised to find their approach anticipated. The leader, a man Calder recognized as one of Jenkins's associates, recovered quickly. "We're here on official business," he announced. "Judge Grant has authorized us to secure this property pending Monday's auction." "No such authorization exists in law," Calder replied evenly. "And you're trespassing on Hayes land." The leader's hand moved toward his holster. "We have orders, Hayes. Step aside, or we'll move you aside." "I wouldn't," Calder advised, not moving. "You're surrounded by armed men who have every legal right to defend this property against intruders, especially those with recent histories of arson and attempted murder." As if on cue, several of Calder's defenders shifted positions, the moonlight glinting off rifle barrels from strategic points around the yard. The message was clear. Grant's men were outflanked, outpositioned, and possibly outgunned. Uncertainty flickered across the leader's face, the confrontation clearly not proceeding as planned. He'd expected to find the ranch minimally defended its owner, unaware of their approach. Instead, he faced an organized resistance. "This changes nothing," he blustered. "The judge's orders stand. This property will be secured." "The judge has no authority to issue such orders," came a new voice from behind Calder. Sheriff Bishop stepped into view, badge gleaming in the moonlight. "And any attempt to forcibly enter constitutes criminal trespass, possibly attempted robbery." More of Calder's defenders revealed themselves, Henderson and his men from the barn ruins, the Miller cousins from behind the corral, Samuel Wright from beside the bunkhouse. All armed, all grimly determined. The leader of Grant's men wavered visibly, glancing at his companions with growing unease. They had expected an easy victory, perhaps even hoped for a violent confrontation they could later justify. Instead, they faced a legally positioned defense with the county sheriff present as witness. "The judge won't be pleased," the man warned bluster, giving way to uncertainty. "The judge," said yet another voice as Willie Grant emerged from the shadows of the porch, "has exceeded his authority, and his own son is here to testify to it." A shocked murmur ran through Grant's men at the sight of Willie standing with those they'd been sent to attack. This final unexpected development seemed to break their resolve. "This ain't worth dying for," one of the riders muttered audibly. "Not for Grant's railroad money." The leader glared at his wavering men, then at Calder and his defenders. "This isn't over, Hayes," he spat. But the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. "It is for tonight," Calder replied steadily. Ride out now and no shots will be fired. Try to enter my property, and we'll exercise our right to defend it." For a tense moment, it seemed the leader might choose violence despite the overwhelming odds. Then, with a muttered curse, he wheeled his horse around. "Let's go," he ordered his men. "The judge needs to know about this development." As the riders retreated back toward the North Ridge, a collective breath seemed to release among Calder's defenders. No shots fired. No blood spilled. A victory of sorts, though all knew it was merely the first skirmish in a larger battle. Sheriff Bishop approached Calder, expression grim but satisfied. "That went better than expected," he observed. "Though Grant won't take this setback lightly." "No," Calder agreed. "He'll regroup, try another approach." "At least we've bought time," Willie interjected, stepping forward. "Time to prepare for Monday's confrontation." Bishop nodded thoughtfully. Grant's overplayed his hand. Sending armed men against a legal property owner with witnesses present, it undermines his position of merely enforcing tax law. "It gives us leverage," Calder realized, "evidence of his true methods." "Exactly," Bishop confirmed. "Between this Davis's testimony and the documents we've gathered, we have a case that even Grant might not be able to dismiss." For the first time in weeks, Calder felt genuine hope kindling. Grant had indeed overreached, revealing the desperation behind his calculated exterior. The judge's power had always depended on isolation, ensuring his victims faced him alone without allies or witnesses. Tonight, that strategy had failed. As the defenders began to stand down, maintaining vigilance but relaxing from immediate battle readiness, Calder caught sight of Grace in the doorway of the house. Relief was evident in her posture, in the way her hand pressed against the doorframe for support. Their eyes met across the yard, and in that moment, something passed between them, a shared understanding, a mutual promise. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Grant's shadow still loomed over Hayes Ranch. The auction still threatened on Monday. The Kansas authorities might still pose danger to Grace, but for the first time, Calder could envision a future beyond these immediate threats. A future with Grace and Annie, with the school Grace envisioned, with a community united against corruption. A future worth fighting for. As dawn broke over the eastern mountains, casting golden light across the land his father had claimed and he had defended, Calder Hayes allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. The battle was far from over, but they had won this night. And in doing so, they had shaken Edward Grant's certainty of victory for the first time. Monday's confrontation at the auction would determine everything: the fate of Hayes Ranch, Grace's freedom, Annie's future. The next 2 days would be crucial for gathering final evidence, securing witnesses, preparing their legal challenge. But as Calder watched Grace emerge fully onto the porch, Annie's small figure appearing sleepily behind her, he knew with bone-deep certainty that whatever happened, they would face it as a family. Not yet officially, perhaps. That question and its answer still waited for a moment beyond crisis. But in all the ways that truly mattered, the bonds had already formed, tested by fire and gunfire, and standing strong. Whatever Edward Grant brought against them next, he would not face Hayes Ranch alone any longer. He would face a united front, a family, a community, a cause. And for the first time, Calder believed they might actually win. Monday morning dawned clear and cool, the late spring sun cresting the mountains to bathe Hayes Ranch in golden light. Calder stood on his porch, freshly shaved and dressed in his best clothes, the suit he'd worn to Martha's funeral, now repurposed for a different kind of reckoning. Behind him, the house stirred with quiet activity. Grace moved efficiently through the kitchen, preparing a hearty breakfast for the men who had stood with them through the night. Annie, mercifully unaware of how much hung in the balance, today helped set the table, chattering softly, her voice growing stronger daily, as if making up for lost time. After Grant's men had retreated Saturday night, Sunday had passed in tense preparation. Sheriff Bishop had ridden to neighboring settlements, gathering additional witnesses to Grant's abuses. Dr. Wilson had organized his medical records documenting accidents that coincided with property transfers. Mrs. Smith had worked with Grace, collecting statements from shopkeepers forced to pay Grant's special taxes. Most surprising had been Willie Grant's contribution. Once his decision to break with his father became known, others who had feared speaking out found courage. The bank clerk provided copies of suspicious transactions. The county clerk confirmed backdated property records. Even Jenkins, facing serious charges and hoping for leniency, had signed a statement detailing payoffs and threats made at the judge's direction. The evidence was substantial, damning, and most importantly, difficult for even Grant to dismiss. But Calder harbored no illusions about the challenge ahead. Edward Grant had not maintained his grip on the county through stupidity or weakness. He would fight with every resource at his disposal. "Ready," Grace's voice came from behind him, pulling him from his thoughts. He turned to find her dressed in her finest, a simple blue dress with a lace collar, her auburn hair neatly arranged. The sight of her, composed and determined, steadied him. "As ready as possible," he replied. "You don't have to come, you know. Grant specifically mentioned Kansas authorities." "All the more reason I should be there," she countered. "I won't hide from false accusations." Calder had expected nothing less. "Annie, Mrs. Miller will stay with her here," Grace confirmed. "We agreed it's safer than bringing her to town." He nodded, relieved. The fewer innocents present for the coming confrontation, the better. Within the hour, a procession formed wagons and riders heading from Hayes Ranch toward Eagles Pass. Nearly 30 people in all, the largest show of opposition Grant had ever faced. Sheriff Bishop rode at the front alongside Calder, his badge prominent, 4 deputies flanking them. Behind came Willie Grant, his presence a powerful statement in itself. As they approached town, Calder noted the unusual activity. Monday was normally quiet in Eagles Pass, but today the streets bustled with people, townsfolk, ranchers from outlying areas, travelers who had heard rumors of confrontation. Grant's auction had become an event, drawing spectators from miles around. "Words spread," Bishop observed. "Good. The more witnesses, the harder for Grant to control the narrative." They proceeded directly to the courthouse, a 2-story brick building dominating the town square. Its steps already crowded with onlookers. At precisely 11 o'clock, 1 hour before the scheduled auction, Calder and his allies dismounted, forming a solemn procession up those steps. Inside the main courtroom had been prepared for the auction. Rows of benches faced a raised platform where Judge Grant's bench stood imposing and authoritative. A smaller table before it displayed property documents and a ledger for recording sales. Grant himself was already present, resplendent in his judicial robes, despite the proceeding being an auction rather than a trial, a deliberate choice, Calder knew, to reinforce his authority. The judge's expression remained impassive as they entered, though his eyes narrowed slightly at the size of the group. "Quite the audience, Mr. Hayes," he remarked, as Calder approached the front. "Though I fear you've misunderstood the proceedings. This is an auction, not a public forum." "I understand perfectly, Your Honor," Calder replied, the formality deliberate. "But before any auction can proceed, there are legal matters that must be addressed." Grant's eyebrow rose fractionally. "The tax assessment has been verified by the territorial office. The auction proceeds as scheduled." "The assessment is fraudulent," Sheriff Bishop stated flatly, stepping forward. as are numerous other actions taken by this court. I have evidence that requires immediate review by higher authorities." The murmur that rippled through the assembled crowd clearly displeased Grant. He gabbled for silence, his facade of judicial detachment slipping momentarily. "This is most irregular, Sheriff," he said coldly. "If you have concerns about official proceedings, there are proper channels, which are controlled by you," Calder interrupted, "just as you control the bank that calls in loans. Suddenly, the tax office that discovers irregularities, and the men who burn out those who refuse to sell." Another louder murmur swept the room. Grant's face darkened. "You forget yourself, Hayes," he warned. "This is still my courtroom." "It's the people's courtroom," Grace spoke up clearly from beside Calder. "And the people have a right to know when justice has been perverted." Grant's gaze fixed on her, recognition and calculation evident. "Miss Evans," he acknowledged, "how interesting that you choose to appear publicly given the authorities who wish to speak with you." "If you mean the Kansas officials," she replied steadily, "I welcome their questions. I have nothing to hide, unlike some in this room." The judge's mouth tightened at the implied accusation. "This auction concerns the Hayes property only. Personal grievances and unfounded accusations have no place here." "Then perhaps we should discuss documented evidence instead," Sheriff Bishop suggested, placing a thick folder on the table before Grant. "Sworn statements from Davis and Jenkins regarding their activities on your behalf. Medical records from Dr. Wilson documenting accidents that correspond with property transfers. Bank records showing your connection to Colorado Eastern Holdings, the company that mysteriously acquires properties seized through your court." Grant did not touch the folder, his gaze sweeping the crowded courtroom. Calder could almost see the calculations behind his eyes, how to regain control, how to dismiss these allegations without appearing defensive. "These are serious accusations," Grant said, finally, his voice measured. "If genuine, they should be presented to the territorial governor for review. But they do not negate the legal proceedings before us today." "They establish pattern and motive," Bishop countered. "The Hayes tax assessment was fraudulent, part of a scheme to seize valuable property for personal gain." "Allegations require proof," Grant replied dismissively. "The assessment bears the territorial seal. A seal you falsified," came a new voice from the back of the courtroom. All heads turned to see Willie Grant making his way forward, his expression resolute despite his obvious discomfort. "Just as you falsified documents for the Miller property, the Henderson Ranch, and half a dozen others." A shocked silence fell over the room. Judge Grant stared at his son, genuine surprise breaking through his careful composure for the first time. "William," he said, voice dangerously quiet, "what do you think you're doing?" "The right thing," Willie replied simply. "Finally." He turned to address the crowded courtroom directly. "Many of you have known me my whole life. You know I've supported my father's endeavors without question. I've benefited from his position, enjoyed privileges at others' expense." His voice strengthened. "And I was wrong. We were wrong." The judge's mask of judicial impartiality cracked completely. "You ungrateful," he began before catching himself. "You know nothing of the complexities involved, the necessities of progress." "I know you ordered men to burn the Miller homestead," Willie countered evenly. "I know you fabricated tax assessments against Hayes and others whose land you coveted for the railroad. I know you received payments from Colorado Eastern Holdings, a company you secretly control, for each property acquired." The accusations hung in the air, damning in their specificity. Grant's face had gone pale with fury, his knuckles white where they gripped the edge of the bench. "These are the desperate lies of a disgruntled son," he declared, rallying. "Unsubstantiated by evidence. "I have evidence," Willie replied, producing a leather portfolio. "Copies of your correspondence with the railroad investors, records of payments to Jenkins and his men, the original property assessments before you altered them." He placed the portfolio beside Bishop's folder. "I've been your confidential secretary for 3 years, Father. I saw everything, kept copies of everything." The courtroom erupted in shocked exclamations, Grant's face contorted with rage and betrayal. Before he could respond, however, another interruption came, this time from the courthouse doors, which opened to admit a distinguished-looking gentleman in an impeccable suit, accompanied by 2 U.S. Marshals. "Judge Edward Grant," the man inquired, his voice carrying authority that immediately quieted the room. "Who asks?" Grant demanded, visibly struggling to regain composure. "Judge Harold Whitman, Federal Circuit Court." The newcomer presented credentials to Sheriff Bishop, who examined them and nodded confirmation. "I've been dispatched by the territorial governor to investigate allegations of judicial misconduct in Eagles Pass." Stunned silence greeted this announcement. Calder exchanged glances with Grace, then Bishop. None of them had expected federal intervention so quickly. Judge Whitman surveyed the crowded courtroom with experienced eyes, taking in the documents on the table, the obvious tension. "It appears I've arrived at an opportune moment," he observed dryly. "These proceedings were underway," Grant objected. "A simple tax auction, which appears to be at the center of the allegations," Whitman noted. "Sheriff Bishop sent a comprehensive report to the governor's office 3 days ago. The evidence was concerning enough to warrant immediate investigation." He turned to address Grant directly. "Judge Grant, you are temporarily relieved of your duties pending this investigation. Please surrender your judicial seal." For a moment it seemed Grant might refuse. His eyes darted around the courtroom, perhaps seeking allies, finding none. Even his usual supporters had been cowed by Willie's testimony and the federal presence. "This is outrageous," he blustered. "A conspiracy against progress, against the very future of this territory. If you're innocent of wrongdoing, the investigation will confirm it," Whitman replied calmly. "The seal, please." With visible reluctance, Grant removed the heavy seal from his desk drawer, placing it before Judge Whitman. The symbolic transfer of authority was not lost on anyone present. "Now," Whitman continued, "as my first official act, I am suspending all property proceedings initiated by this court within the past year pending review. This includes today's auction of the Hayes property." Relief surged through Calder, though he maintained a composed exterior. Beside him, Grace's hand found his squeezing tightly. "Sheriff," Whitman addressed Bishop, "please secure all court records and documents. Nothing is to be removed or destroyed." He gestured to the marshals who moved to take positions at key exits. "Judge Grant, you will remain available for questioning. Consider yourself restricted to town limits until further notice." Grant's face had gone from pale to mottled red. "This is beyond your authority," he sputtered. "I have powerful friends in Denver and Washington, who will be most interested to learn of these proceedings," Whitman finished for him. "As will the Railroad Commission, I imagine." Turning to address the packed courtroom, Whitman raised his voice. "This court is now under federal jurisdiction. All citizens with evidence regarding Judge Grant's conduct are encouraged to come forward. Justice will be served, but through proper legal channels, not rumor or vigilantism." The firm but fair declaration seemed to satisfy most present. The tension that had built for weeks began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious optimism that proper authority had finally arrived. For Calder, the relief was profound, but tempered by wariness. Grant had been neutralized, but not yet defeated. The battle for Hayes Ranch and for justice in Eagles Pass had merely entered a new phase. As the crowd began to disperse, Judge Whitman approached Calder and Grace directly. "Mr. Hayes, I presume, and Miss Evans, I'd like to speak with you both privately. Your testimony will be crucial to this investigation." "Of course, Your Honor," Calder agreed. "Though I should mention that Miss Evans has been threatened with legal action from Kansas regarding a matter there." Whitman's expression turned thoughtful. "Yes, I'm aware. Sheriff Bishop included that in his report." He glanced at Grace. "Rest assured, Miss Evans, any legitimate legal questions will be addressed fairly. But I'm not inclined to entertain manipulated charges used as leverage in an unrelated matter." The knot of tension that had lingered in Grace's shoulders visibly released. "Thank you, Your Honor." As they followed Whitman to a side room for their initial statements, Calder caught sight of Edward Grant, being escorted from the courtroom not in chains, but clearly under observation. The judge's imperious demeanor had crumbled, leaving an aging man whose carefully constructed empire was collapsing around him. Their eyes met briefly across the room. Grant's gaze burned with impotent fury, and Calder thought a flash of genuine fear. For a man whose power had depended on projecting invulnerability, this public humiliation might be worse than any legal punishment that followed. Calder felt no satisfaction in the man's downfall, only relief that his threat had been neutralized, and a determination to see justice properly served. The investigation proceeded with remarkable efficiency over the following days. Judge Whitman established temporary court in Eagles Pass, methodically reviewing evidence, taking statements, and untangling Grant's web of corruption. Willie Grant's testimony proved particularly damning. As his father's confidential secretary, he had detailed knowledge of the judge's dealings with railroad investors' arrangements with men like Jenkins and the systematic targeting of properties along the proposed rail line. Davis and Jenkins, facing serious charges themselves, provided corroborating testimony in exchange for leniency. The bank records confirmed irregular transactions between Grant's personal accounts and shell companies connected to the railroad. By the end of the week, Edward Grant had been formally charged with judicial misconduct, corruption conspiracy, and most seriously, incitement to arson and attempted murder in the cases of the Miller homestead and Hayes Ranch. For Calder, Grace and Annie, life gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy. The threat of losing the ranch had evaporated with Judge Whitman's first declaration, the fraudulent tax assessment officially nullified. Rebuilding the burned structures began immediately, neighbors and friends contributing labor and materials in a spirit of community reborn. On a warm evening, 10 days after the courthouse confrontation, Calder and Grace sat on the newly repaired porch, watching Annie play with a litter of kittens that had taken up residence in the rebuilt barn. The simple domestic scene felt miraculous after weeks of crisis. Sheriff Bishop brought news from town, Calder mentioned, breaking their comfortable silence. Grant's being transferred to Denver for trial, federal charges now given the railroad connection. Grace nodded thoughtfully. And Willie testifying for the prosecution. In exchange, he avoids charges himself. Calder watched Annie's delighted interaction with the kittens. Bishop says he's planning to head west afterward, make a fresh start. "I hope he finds peace," Grace said, surprising Calder with her generosity toward a man who had once harassed her. "He made the right choice in the end. That counts for something." "It does," Calder agreed, marveling at her capacity for forgiveness, a quality he was still working to develop himself. Another comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by Annie's laughter and the distant lowing of cattle. The ranch was healing just as they were. "I received a letter today," Grace said finally. "From Lucy Wilson." Calder turned to her, interested. "The woman from Kansas. Good news, I hope." The best, Grace smiled. She and her daughter are settled in Oregon. Safe, happy. She's teaching at a local school. Her expression turned wistful. She sent me a pressed flower from their garden, said it reminded her that new life can bloom after the harshest storms. Wise woman, Calder observed. Speaking of schools, he hesitated. Judge Whitman approved your petition. 5 acres on the south corner of the ranch can be officially designated for the school you wanted to build. Grace's eyes widened. Already? But I only filed the paperwork 3 days ago. Apparently the judge believes in educational initiatives, Calder said with a smile, and in making amends for his predecessor's actions. The grant includes funds for building materials with the stipulation that the school serve all children in the county, regardless of background. Joy bloomed across Grace's face. That's more than I dared hope for. You deserve it, Calder said simply. You gave Annie back her voice. Soon you'll do the same for others. Grace's hand found his on the porch rail, their fingers intertwining naturally. We did this together, she corrected. All of it. Calder studied their joined hands, thinking of all they had endured in the short time since Grace's arrival at Hayes Ranch. Threats, fire, gunfire, legal battles, challenges that might have broken lesser spirits. Yet here they sat stronger for having faced them together. I believe, he said slowly, that I promised to ask you a question when Grant's shadow no longer hung over us. Grace's breath caught her eyes, lifting to his. I believe you did. Calder shifted to face her, fully taking both her hands in his. I'm not one for flowery speeches, he began. Never have been, but I know what I feel, what I want. He paused, gathering courage. When Martha died, I thought that part of my life was over. That Annie and I would go on alone, and that would be enough. Grace listened intently, her green eyes never leaving his face. Then you arrived, he continued, with your quiet strength and your stubborn kindness. You brought life back to this house, voice back to my daughter. His voice roughened. And hope back to me. He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a simple gold band, not Martha's, which remained in its place of honor in his drawer, but one he had commissioned from the town jeweler specifically for Grace. Grace Evans, he said, voice steady despite the emotion behind it. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, of being a mother to Annie, of building your school and our future on this land together? Tears welled in Grace's eyes, but her smile was radiant. Yes, she whispered, with all my heart, yes. Calder slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit. Before he could speak again, she leaned forward, capturing his lips in a kiss that conveyed everything words could not, Joy promise. Commitment, love. When they parted, Annie stood before them, her small face alight with understanding beyond her years. Is Grace staying forever now? She asked, her once silent voice clear in the evening air. If that's what you want, little one, Calder replied, extending his arm to include her in their embrace. Annie nodded solemnly. I asked her to be my mama, she confided, in the cave when the bad men came. And what did she say? Calder asked, glancing at Grace, whose eyes shimmered with tears. She said we had to ask you first, Annie reported. But her heart already said yes. Grace laughed softly, the sound mingling with the evening breeze. Wise beyond your years, Miss Annie Hayes. The three of them sat together on the porch steps, Annie nestled between them as the sun began its descent behind the western mountains. The land stretched before them, Hayes land hard won and preserved for future generations. Land that would now see not just cattle and crops, but children learning a family, growing a community healing. In the gathering dusk, Calder Hayes surveyed his domain with quiet pride. The challenges had been immense, the cost nearly unbearable at times. But they had emerged victorious not just in keeping the land, but in finding something far more precious upon it. A home, a family, a future. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Calder's arm tightened around Grace and Annie. Whatever trials tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. The defender of the Highlands, the woman who had brought healing with bread and courage, and the child whose recovered voice symbolized all they had overcome. Together on the land that had called to generations of Hayes men, they would build something lasting, something worth defending, something like love. The end.